I hope everything is working. I will wait a little bit to see how everything reacts on all my devices. I am trying to account for like that small OBS delay between like pressing going live and it actually going live. But yeah, well, what can you do? Sometimes it just doesn't work, but by the time I actually obviously start doing something, it should work. Okay, so I seem to be on. It seems to be working, at least on my own channel. Okay, I have a small problem with it wanting to connect to my other devices, my AirPods. I'm sorry. I'll turn that off everywhere. Good. Now it should be normal as far as I'm concerned, but please let me know if there are any audio problems. Once again, I haven't done it in a while. I have yet another new streaming setup because my tech in my home keeps changing. So I don't have a very comfortable place to set up my laptop. I think in the future I will just live stream directly from my laptop, and this is one stream where I actually need my AirPods, so the kind of like auto connect and disconnect feature is actually kind of annoying in this scenario. So regardless, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a new MarkTech video. I know it's been a while, and I know that this isn't necessarily quite what you've been expecting from me unless you've seen me on Twitter, which is a whole other discussion. I wanted to make a video about Twitter, but I think they've changed all of the rate limit exceeded nonsense, at least in my area. I haven't encountered it after yesterday. Elon Musk is a moron. That's just all I wanted to say. And regardless of all that, I really wanted to react to something else. And that something else is not even necessarily SkillUp's review of Final Fantasy XVI, but I wanted to react to Final Fantasy XVI in general. Because in my opinion, it's a freaking phenomenal game. I think it has some obvious flaws, and I'm glad that people are calling those out so that games don't necessarily like get perfect scores if they don't deserve it. However, I think there is a very, very wrong narrative going around, which is that because Final Fantasy XVI is not perfect, it's somehow not good. It's like the classic fallacy of letting the perfect become the enemy of the good, or in this case, the very good and excellent even. Final Fantasy XVI is a phenomenal game that I would rate about a 9 out of 10. It does have issues where I would rate obviously games like God of War higher. Granted, God of War is like my all-time favorite game, but then even closer following something like Ghost of Tsushima, which also does have its own fair share of problems, but I think overall executes on some things a little bit better. So I hope you are interested in this take, because I know that this is a tech channel and an Apple channel, and obviously now we are talking about Final Fantasy XVI, a game which, like, yes, I know that people in the Apple community play games, but this isn't even something like on the App Store. It's not even something on PC, which you could theoretically like play through Apple's translation tools. No, this is a PlayStation 5 exclusive. It's a Square Enix games that Sony helped a lot with development. They gave up money up front, so it would be very polished by release. It is, minus some performance issues. This game has like close to no bugs. I've seen like some overheating claims. In my opinion, those are the results of people having like, I don't know, like 90% dust in their PS5 by now, or maybe they use their PS5 in like closed off entertainment system, which to me is like always the kiss of death for any kind of electronic, to use it in a closed off environment. My PS5 has been like not just whisper quiet, it's been completely quiet when I play Final Fantasy 16. I've tried both the fidelity and the performance mode. So this is yet another criticism that I see around. This is not obviously something that SkillUp will be saying, but like, yeah, people who are claiming that their PS5s are dying because of Final Fantasy 16 are either lying or they are stupid. which if there are like legitimate issues with a PS5 crashing, especially at a certain point in the game, that is not an overheating issue. That is a bug, maybe even a bug that like puts like the PS5, like the processor in some kind of like loop task that might lead to actual overheating. This is not a problem with the PS5 not being able to handle the actual load of their SoC, their system on a chip, with their cooling system. It doesn't matter to me which PS5 you have. Like, if a PS5 actually overheated, it would overheat in something like God of War running at 90 FPS, because that thing would tax both CPU and GPU, which would much more increase the risk of like heat buildup that the cooling system couldn't get rid of. It's a stupid discussion. I'm not going to acknowledge it any further. This is just something that I had a lot of energy and wanted to get rid of. Again, if anybody else tunes in, please leave a like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you want me to talk about next. I know a lot of you will want me to get back to Apple related content, and I definitely will. We should be getting some new betas next week, and I think after a week or so with them, I should have a much better understanding of everything from iOS 17, iPadOS 17, macOS Sonoma, watchOS 10, which my watch struggled with installing the second beta, and then I saw the workaround but didn't want to bother with that before installing the next one. So yeah, there will be a lot of Apple content, like at least as much as possible for a period where we aren't actually getting new hardware, but I hope you still engage with my channel, with my Twitter account. God, I hate Twitter, but that's where I met a lot of you. So without further ado, let's get to SkillUp. And before I actually start the video, let me give you some context. So let's not just get into it. But I like SkillUp. SkillUp is actually my favorite YouTube reviewer for games. And some might say, oh, so you cannot disagree with him once? No, that's not the point. For one, I disagree with him more often than once. I don't necessarily need all my opinions to be one-to-one with a reviewer I like. But this was actually something that I consider like, it's in the typical SkillUp fashion. It's like relatively high production value. It's well edited. His choice of words is usually very good, right? He's very literate, or I would say, like in the most dumb way. Like, he sounds smart because he is smart. And I like a lot of his content in general. I do tune into his podcast sometimes. So this is not a hate video of me trying to catch somebody off guard. This is me legitimately thinking that this video is subpar to SkillUp's usual quality, and I will actually call out moments where he tries to be nuanced, right? So he does give himself the same kind of out that he would usually have in one of his higher quality videos, but I would say there are legitimate moments where he falls completely short. Like, I would say a good comparison to this would be a game like Horizon Forbidden West, right? It's a game where he didn't like the story, especially at the end, but he liked pretty much everything else. So he had a very positive, like I believe he said he would give it a 9.5 if he were to give it a rating, but he doesn't. He just recommends or something like that. And I think that his expectations for a Final Fantasy game and his own like dislike of certain elements, which I disagree with, but he obviously has a right to, overshadowed his overall perception of the quality of the game, which I think is very high. So I don't want to say like he didn't give the game a fair shot because of the expectations, but he definitely had a different mindset, I would say, for this game than he usually does when he reviews like an indie game or even like a AAA game for maybe a franchise that he doesn't have the same kind of attachment to. So it's understandable. That's why I'm not hating on him, even though throughout the video I probably will get a little zesty. So I just really wanted to make sure you understand with what mindset I'm coming in and why I really wanted to make this video. I fully understand that given the nature of my channel, both the size and the usual content, that this video will perform terribly, but I do hope that this will just give me an outlet for my frustrations and then we can be done with it. But who knows, if you like it, maybe I will do more content like that in the future. So let's start.
This video is sponsored by Eureka Ergonomic, a premium destination for anyone looking to furnish their home office, living room, or gaming setup. Click the link below or stick around to learn more about their range of top quality products, including their Aero standing desk, which I just set up in my own home, and I love it. Thanks, Eureka. Alright, important disclaimer to start. Do not worry about what I think about Final Fantasy 16. I'm just a nerd with a microphone and a YouTube account. Reviews are already out for this. Everyone loves it.
But on a very different level.
95% of critics recommend it. Walk into a room of 10 people and 9.5 of them are going to love Final Fantasy 16. So don't fixate on any one review, especially this one, since I'm in the very, very small minority here, and you should definitely not let my take stop you from experiencing something that there's every chance you'll love. Okay, fair. So this is what I like about SkillUp. His reviews are not like, unless you consider like real garbage like Golem, where he will try to make you not play something so that the studio doesn't get money for a garbage product, so that you don't feel cheated by a garbage product. He is right in saying, obviously, that no review should dictate your own opinion, but I think this is a specific special case where he really understands that his own opinion will detract from many others and might actually get him some hate here. Fantasy 16. It really pains me to say that I don't like this and I don't think it's particularly good. It breaks my heart.
Okay, this is where I already disagree with him, but obviously we'll get into much more detail. My point about this is that he says he doesn't like it, which is absolutely fair, right? Nobody's forced to like anything. But he's saying it's not very good, right? And I think with some objective criteria, this game actually is really good. So this is, I know obviously if he thought it was very good, he most likely would have liked it. But I think this is one case where personal perception overshadows a more objective take.
Because I'm a massive Final Fantasy fan. 8 and 10 are two of my favorite games. I really loved 7 Remake.
Yeah, I should actually go into that with much more detail, which is I am not a big Final Fantasy guy. Final Fantasy 7 Remake was my first Final Fantasy 7 game. Since then, I've dabbled through emulation and stuff like that in the original titles. Yeah, definitely not for me, but and then I've tried like the Pixel remaster on my iPad. Again, those were available on mobile for some reason first before console. Yeah, like I didn't connect with them, so I tried one. Obviously, I didn't buy all 6 because of that. Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII are the other games that I've played. Not fully though, because, well, I played the first Final Fantasy X fully and liked it, but I thought it was kind of monotonous. And then Final Fantasy X-2, I didn't play, and then Final Fantasy XII, I think I played like an hour or something like that. So yeah, I'm definitely not a big Final Fantasy guy. And to be fully honest, even with Final Fantasy X, I had like a friend help me set up like all the right stuff, and even then it became Pokemon-esque, I would say, in like a lot of like, oh yeah, this fits best, so I'm clicking this attack again and again and again. Again, this is not a criticism of Final Fantasy. I know that 10 and 12 are beloved. I know that Final Fantasy 11 is like a milestone MMO for console. I've tried Final Fantasy 14, but I'm really not an MMO guy, so it, like, even if it shares like the devs, it doesn't mean anything to me, because that's not the type of game that I enjoy. I'm not a World of Warcraft guy, not a Path of Exile guy, not a Final Fantasy 14 guy, so New World, all that stuff. I know about it, I try some of it occasionally, but it's not for me. So SkillUp definitely comes more into this as a fan. However, Final Fantasy VII Remake is one of my favorite games of all time. So I would call myself overall a fan of Final Fantasy, maybe in the context of like the new era of Final Fantasy.
Really, really love Final Fantasy XIV. I think it is extraordinary in so many ways, and I have so much admiration for the team behind it. When Yoshi P took over leadership of Creative Business Unit 3, he and that team made history by resurrecting one of the most doomed MMOs ever released, and since then he and his team have gone on to deliver banger after banger, each expansion somehow better than the last, except for Stormblood, but even that was still pretty good. So that team, Creative Business Unit 3, they're the ones making Final Fantasy 16. So I went into this extremely excited because I was very keen to see this team spin on a mainline entry, and also because I got to play some of it myself back in February when I visited Square Enix in Japan, allowing me to see firsthand this new vision for the franchise. How is it new? Well, Final Fantasy 16 moves the franchise away from its turn-based roots and turns it into a character action game, similar to something like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. I know many people were skeptical about that move, but I was along for the ride because...
And again, this is something where I would say this is objectively not fully true. Like, yes, all previous games, except for the MMOs, and except for Final Fantasy 15, which was like a little bit of a hybrid, and then Final Fantasy 7 Remake, which some people call it a hybrid, but it's definitely much more of an action-based game. Just because it slows down the time for your attacks doesn't actually mean that it's actually like turn-based. You still have to make sure that you're not like standing in front of enemy fire and something like that. So this is not... it does not behave at all like a turn-based game. To me, a turn-based game is something like I see an enemy's turn, it's time for my turn, and then if I basically don't do anything, I could go back to the game in like 5 hours and I still would be able to press my turn. That's why Pokemon works so well for something like a Game Boy or like just a portable system in general. Like, also the game is not very challenging overall, but yeah, so there were definitely other exceptions to the turn-based stuff, but even in terms of turn-based, there are very different takes from what I understand, and even 10 and 12 felt very different to each other, and obviously something like Final Fantasy 1 or 2, I wouldn't even compare it because of how much the genre has evolved. So there will be some stuff, like when he says it's like it went from a turn-based RPG to an action character game, and he kind of wished it went from a turn-based RPG to an action RPG, and he will name some examples. And there will be some points that I actually agree with, but not the overall point. So let's get
I trust the team behind it, and I enjoyed what I played of it. I really did, so I was fully on board with this. However, when I interviewed Yoshi P, I asked him, why does this franchise need to evolve in this way and become a real-time character?
Final Fantasy 15 sold poorly. It sold like well for a week because, well, it was a multi-plat game. It sold on a larger install base than the PS5 had right now. And it had a lot of like build up to it because it had been kind of a while because the game was like rebooted mid-development. So people were very eager for something new from Final Fantasy. And the overall perception of Final Fantasy was, I would say the MMO perception right now is much more positive than the general perception of Final Fantasy was back then. But Final Fantasy was really held in high regard, and I would say Final Fantasy 15 came in and killed that to a big part. I've tried playing it; it's hard to get into the game, and even just beyond that, like when the game originally came out, it was basically like half finished in terms of content. It took like DLC and add-on movies and books and something like that, and then like the Final Fantasy 15 Royal Edition, or I believe it's called, to actually like summarize it all, to get it all into one package. I would say that if there's any kind of like bad blood towards Final Fantasy as a franchise, it primarily comes from Final Fantasy 15. And Final Fantasy VII Remake, it's a very different game. I know, like, some people will say, oh, it didn't sell too well on PS5. My counter to that is it's kind of a niche title. I know it's Final Fantasy VII. Shouldn't that be like the most popular thing ever? But like time has passed. People were somewhat weirded out to see like casuals that like there's like a Final Fantasy VII game after like 15, and while 14 was like going strong. And yeah, so I would say like Final Fantasy VII Remake just didn't market itself that right. I think it still sold well, and then it went on to PlayStation Plus. So overall, it definitely was a success, and now we're getting Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. However, I would say that the overall perception of the franchise going into this game has been a little bit tarnished by Final Fantasy 15, at least by the launch date of Final Fantasy 15.
The action game, why couldn't it remain a turn-based game or a hybrid turn-based game like in Final Fantasy VII
Like,
Remake?
look at that! What is the hybrid there? Like, I'm sorry, but like this idea that like Final Fantasy VII Remake is hybrid in like a 50-50 sense, it's like 90% action, 10% turn-based.
Essentially said that Final Fantasy is kind of like an aging franchise.
Yes,
and that
it
kids
is.
these days wouldn't be interested in turn-based combat. They
Yeah,
play
I
Call of
wouldn't
Duty
be.
and Grand Theft Auto.
This
They
is not
expect
Dragon Quest. It's a
instantaneous
franchise
response
that
when you
has
press a
always
button.
evolved.
Just couldn't see how that generation of gamers would ever want to play a turn-based game. So it was essential that Final Fantasy evolved to become something else. Back then, his answer did not sit right with me. I think it ignores the success of the Xenoblade series, which is that kind of ATB-style metronomic turn-based combat. I think it ignores the phenomenal success of the Persona series, which is just straight up turn-based. And most importantly, I think it ignores the success of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I think delivered an absolutely brilliant evolution of party-based, turn-based combat. It was just a pitch-perfect fusion of the old and new.
Yeah, we will get to that point as well, like the party stuff. Like, to anybody who actually knows like the history of Final Fantasy, and I know more than I have played, right? So Final Fantasy VII actually, at its time when it launched, like the original, not the remake, had the smallest party out of any previous Final Fantasy game. I believe it went to like 3 extra party members, and the originals were like 5 again. I'm not an expert, but this is kind of the overall like truth. The point with this is, like, why does every Final Fantasy game have to do those things, especially in the modern era? And he's asking specifically Yoshi P, who got like a DMC5. By the way, I'm not much of a fan of DMC5, so I'm not defending this because I so wanted an a character action game. No, I defend this because I actually really like it being a character action game. So I do not like Bayonetta, I do not like DMC, so me actually liking this is kind of special to me, and I disagree with the idea that, of course people would like turn-based games. Look at the phenomenal success of, looking at my watch, Persona. Like, yeah, Persona, known to be like the largest franchise currently. Like, yeah, it's like super popular in Japan and definitely has its fair market in the West, but it's definitely not something that would warrant like the kind of like budget that is being put into this. I would wager if this was like, and this game probably costs like around $300 million, like with marketing and stuff like that. Maybe like if the marketing gets like really aggressive and like the PC port and everything else, like it could go up to like 400 million overall. And I do believe that it will make this money back over time. But it's kind of tough. Like there is definitely a lot to consider here. There have been like reports that it's like a $500 million game just from the development. Nah, I will never believe that. Like people try to compare it to like the budget of Final Fantasy 15. That game was like rebooted halfway through. You cannot compare that.
Really love that. In my interview, Yoshi P never spoke about Final Fantasy VII Remake when he talked about the Final Fantasy franchise. It was as though it was kind of a blind spot in his view of where the franchise was at this point, and that was putting aside the fact that Final Fantasy 15 was pretty much an action game by most metrics. I recount all of this now.
Yes, so this is what I don't understand. Final Fantasy 15 was an action game, like mostly. But it was the worst one than Final Fantasy 16. I don't get it. Again, we will get to some RPG criticism that I agree with when it comes to SkillUp's points. But overall, like, I don't think anybody will look at this and claim that like the gameplay is worse than Final Fantasy 15.
Because I feel like in Square Enix's haste to evolve this franchise to something new, they've left behind far too much that made Final Fantasy Final Fantasy. In trying to reach out to a new audience,
Bullshit.
they've left behind the audience that has got the franchise to this point. Critically, I feel like in trying to create
I hate this idea, like, oh, they left old fans behind. Yes, that's what, like, God of War 2018 left old fans behind who wanted it to stay like a character action game, like with those super fast, flashy movements, that giant scope of the environment. It became a more personal tale, still the tale of a god, but a tale where you are looking over the shoulder of the god, and where the god definitely is slower than he used to be. But it had its own special appeal, and it became the most popular game in the franchise. So to me, it's very hard to like this is where I get a little annoyed, because every franchise eventually evolves. It's kind of like saying, oh, why does Harry Potter get darker as it gets older? Because it evolves with the fan base. And yes, it could lead some old fans behind who fell in love with like the positive and bright stuff in the first one, or even like through half of the second one, even though the second one does get kind of dark in the end. Like, it just changes. It evolves with a certain part of a fan base, it leaves a certain part of a fan base behind, and then it attracts new people to those people who left, but also even on top, just growing the fan base. Very rarely do you see like a franchise that just keeps on growing without ever pissing off somebody who loved it prior. And I think to make it look like this game is kind of disrespectful to the franchise is very wrong, in my opinion. And I'm so sorry, we're like 25 minutes in, and I'm like 3 minutes into his review, so I will get with it
middling semi-open world
faster.
action game that feels dated in almost all of its aspects, bar its combat and presentation.
Wrong.
Final Fantasy 16 offers
Nasty SkillUp.
and three things only. Firstly, it offers a sprawling saga that is very centered on one man, Clive Rosfield. There are some party members, sort of, but nothing compared to the sort of companionship that previous Final Fantasy...
Okay, we will get to that too, but like the actual party grows organically throughout the game. And this is something that that SkillUp couldn't mention, because there are some reveals midway through the game that do open you up to like a new party member, and you like might not keep all party members that you had in the beginning, and then some change, and there are some side quests where you can choose which one comes along. So it's not like a set party like game, but it definitely has companions that you interact with that grow throughout the game. They just don't stay glued to your side every waking second. And when you actually look at Clive's power set and how other characters may struggle with their powers, you will see throughout the game that storytelling wise it makes a lot of sense why Clive is very much a lone wolf or a +1 guy, right? Plus, obviously, Torgil is best boy ever, and we never say a bad word about Torgil here. But like, he has his dog, and then a friend, and or a girlfriend, and that's kind of it. And then he maybe interchanges them.
Fantasy casts have offered. Secondly, it offers a combat system that is satisfying and accessible, but it takes a long time to get going, and enemy variety fails to keep combat feeling fresh and challenging. And thirdly, Final Fantasy XVI offers some cutting-edge presentation showcasing the power of the PS5 as few games have been able to do, but it runs pretty badly in that performance mode even after the day one patch. Outside of that, there's really nothing. There are essentially no party members, either in combat or narratively.
Okay, so there's a story, which if you like the story, that's definitely a plus, because I would say that like I didn't love the story in many Final Fantasy games, from what I heard, but also for like I didn't connect at all with Final Fantasy 12, and Final Fantasy 10 kind of left a little bit of sour taste in my mouth. But again, it's not a game for me necessary, right? It's a game that obviously is somewhat of a different era, and just playing the remake didn't connect with me. That's not me actually saying it's a bad game, which kind of is what SkillUp is saying. So you get a story, you get a combat system that takes a while to get going. It's a weird, like, yes, you grow through it, but like Final Fantasy 16 is actually not super long for a Final Fantasy game, I would argue. Like, if you focus only on the story quest, you get through it relatively quickly. Like, it took me 25 hours to get through the main story with a few side quests. I'm now about 40 hours into the game with like most side quests done, and not 100%ing the game. So I will there is some stuff that opens up once you have done some side quests. So there is some. So I quite honestly don't know if like I'm 70% through or 90% through. So don't take me by my word when I say I've done almost all of it. But I've done, for example, all of the more emotional side quests by now. So the better ones. So I will definitely get to that once SkillUp starts criticizing the side quests a lot. But without trying to spoil. But and I've started a file for New Game Plus in Final Fantasy difficulty. So I will play through the game, though probably in like half a year. I usually like to take a break so that like my next playthrough is actually like really, really meaningful to me.
There's no itemization except in the most bare bones.
And yes, he will criticize now what the game didn't have, but he's like saying the game has a story, the game has like a combat, and yes, you can argue how good those are. In my opinion, they are very good. And then he tries to list of stuff that the game somewhat doesn't have. And I'm not against like the itemization in this game for the actual weapons and stuff, and like your armor sucks. I would actually say that like the amulets you get are really good, because they're primarily tuned for like just what shit do you like more, what do you want to make flashier, faster, right? Like which attack do you want to have like a faster recovery time and stuff like that. And obviously there are also the items from like the easiest mode. And I've played around with it. Yes, the game is super easy with those items. However, I have to say that's what makes the game double accessible. And if you don't do much side questing, you also are never really over leveled. So yeah, like there's some criticism here that just to me like, oh, the game has visuals, a story, combat, likable characters, but it's not like all packaged the way I like it. That's Let's get through it before I get too angry.
It has none of the strategic depth that might leverage things such as elemental weaknesses or status magics. There are precious few explorable sections of the map, and none of them have anything to offer in terms of surprises or discovery. The side quests on offer are so dull that they'd make a Realm Reborn side quest blush. There's no humor in the writing, there's no...
That side quest he actually showed, I think I will spoil it because it's a small side quest, but it's about one of the bearers, basically one of the slaves in this village that consists of former bearers of Rosaria, which is where Clive was the son of the Duke. And one of those bearers is an old man who used to work in the kitchen. And basically, the leader of this village asks Clive to talk to this man, to basically like get him out of his stupor and get him out of his depression, because all he does is he sits at one spot in the village. But on that day that you come to the village, he had wandered off. He obviously is old, he's somewhat disoriented. And when you arrive to him and confront him, or well, positively, he mistakes you for your father, for the Duke of Rosaria. And it's one of those moments where it goes back to a genre like slice of life, right? Because I can completely agree that when I play a game like The Witcher, for example. Again, I'm not a huge Witcher fan, but The Witcher has some side quests that are more elaborately set up. You don't just talk to somebody, there's some environmental storytelling and stuff like that. And yes, this has a lot of MMO stuff, which is you go to one character, talk to him, then there is a map marker, you run to that map marker, you probably fight some enemies, and then you talk to the other person, and then the quest is completed. That's most side quests, and I would agree that core setup by itself is boring and unimaginative and pretty old-fashioned. However, when it comes to the actual stuff that is in there, obviously I think by now it's quite famous, like the boy with the wolf side quest who like kills his slaves by making him fight wolf, like a pet wolf, and even a story like this, which is kind of a touching moment where Clive channels his father a little bit, where he understands a lot what his father meant to the people of the kingdom, or I don't know what's called, duchy. Yeah, I'm not British, sorry. And there are a lot of quests that are better than this one in terms of their story significance. There's a very touching one that he much later on has with Jill. There is one with Gav, which I love as who I love as a character, that basically like gives an end to Gav. Not saying he dies, I'm not spoiling any of that, I'm just saying that it meaningfully ends his arc, I would say, at least for the game. So there is a lot here, and I understand that not everything will hit, and that's kind of the point. I kind of would have cut like 30% of the side quests in favor of the really good ones, but I kind of see how Yoshi P is like an MMO developer who, in MMO, like, content is king. Like, people love to have anything to do in an MMO because they put like 300 hours into the game, so anything that even resembles the story is kind of positively received. And in this case, I kind of have to say they went a little overboard. They should have more focused on the higher quality side quests. But the idea that all of them are bad is completely wrong. And it is mostly said by people who clearly didn't play all side quests. And I didn't even play all side quests yet.
Minigame, there's just not a lot going on outside of the combat and those cutscenes. Most crucially, the pacing of this game is diabolically bad, delivering
Wrong. I will get to that. It's like, no, it's not. It's a game that I finished in 25 hours with like a multi-country spanning story, like characters from your past, a mysterious powers awakening. I finished it in less time than I finished God of War Ragnarok. So no, I profoundly disagree that this is a poorly paced game. Yes, there are moments where you run back and forth, like some main quests have like some of the side quest structure, but it's really easy to go through it. Like, it doesn't take that much time. It's not like the old Final Fantasy games in that regard. I would even say on the map, if you're trying to find all items throughout the map, it's not much. I will not say that SkillUp is wrong, that the world design is like super innovative, but it's kind of what the world should be. So I'm not one of the guys who says, oh, the world has to be like super realistic in like a Final Fantasy game. But yeah, it's like, it's cities where you can talk to people, interact with them. And it's a countryside where there isn't much stuff except for enemies. And there even is like a story understanding of why that is, which is that previously like more inhabited like village areas have now been sort of decimated because there's a blight. There's like basically a disease of the land that destroys large part of the continent, and this is why beasts are now roaming in territories that previously were reserved only for humans because their natural habitat was destroyed. It's an environmental allegory, guys. No, seriously, it's about climate change, but this is also a very liberal standpoint, like trying to equate everything to climate change. But yeah, this definitely has the climate change allegory. But regardless, like, there is a story understanding of why areas are deserted, why you get obviously more people interaction in towns than you get outside. And quite honestly, the idea that like, oh, I'm finding no items throughout the overworld. Well, guess what? The items in this game, and I agree with that with SkillUp, they mostly suck except for like potions, which, by the way, I did tune in, that I did activate one of the like easy game things, which I think makes potions tune in automatically or something like that. Or I don't know what I have activated. It's been a while since I set up the game originally. But yeah, so the idea that like the world has to be like super populated, it's weird because like even looking at like the original Zelda game, like sure you can like find a dungeon or something like that, like if we're talking more like action games, but overall like you find people, they send you on quests, you kill enemies, and then if the game is focused on items, you get items, and in this game it's far less focused on items. That's it.
Euphoric highs, followed by sometimes hours of inane chatter and busy work. Anyone who's played through Final Fantasy XIV's main scenario quest lines will know exactly what I mean by this. That is actually a very important touch point. Final Fantasy XVI feels like a Final Fantasy XIV expansion main scenario questline. It is 75% cutscenes, and that is not an exaggerated number, by the way.
It's an exaggerated
number. A little bit of
number.
Running around and some combat. In 14, that worked for so many reasons, but not least of all because you knew that when the MSQ was over, there was this gigantic game waiting for you at the other side. There is nothing waiting for you at the other side.
But that's a different kind of game. Like, that's how budgets work. Like, you get one main story in an MMO or like an MMO-like game. Like, let's take even something like Diablo, right? You have a main story, and you have to obviously fight Lilith. Let's take Diablo 4, right? And then you have an after game where, yes, there are dungeons, yes, there is like Uber Lilith and stuff like that, but the problem with that is like this, like when you try to compare the main story of Final Fantasy to most MMOs, it's completely incomparable. And then you try to compare it to something like Diablo 4, which does have higher quality like cinematics and stuff like that, but it's in a completely different level. Like this idea that like you could equate like Final Fantasy 16, sorry if I called it 15 before that you could just say that it's like part of like an MMO main story, and then like, as I said, the side stories are very MMO-esque in their setup, and I would also say in their more budget friendliness in comparison to the main story. But no, overall, I wouldn't say that it feels like an expansion to an MMO.
Except for a new game plus. If you don't like this character, this story, and this combat system, then there's just
I'm sorry. If I don't like the main character, if I don't like the story around him, if I don't like the combat system in the game, I don't care what, like, it's kind of like all those channels are like, oh, World of Warcraft is complete garbage. I've put 1,000 hours into it, so I should know. I'm like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, why did you put 1,000 hours into it if it's garbage? It's like, well, but like the game after the like story and all the quests and everything is like, I grinded a lot. I'm like, okay, good. If that's for you, sure. But like, that's not what ever like Final Fantasy like was to me in the other games. Like, I didn't like play Final Fantasy VII Remake beyond the first story, beyond like replaying chapters, beyond like trying out some new combinations. Again, we go back to some RPG elements that this game is lacking. But for example, in this game, like I played through like the Phoenix powers mostly. I played with the powers of Odin, which is like the sword that can cut through anything. This is Katana, she's got my back. I'm sorry. If you know what that reference means. Then the third one was Bahamut. Obviously, Bahamut is the best icon ever. But I would want to, like, if I replay the game, for example, I would like to play with Shiva. It's a very emotional moment when you get Shiva, and I kind of felt bad for never really using her. I would like to try some of the Titan stuff as well, and then I will probably keep Bahamut, because Bahamut is the best icon. But yeah, it's okay. I would also try out with Garuda. Mainly thinking of Benedicta while doing so.
Nothing else here for you to enjoy. It is such a stark contrast to other Final Fantasy games, which seem to offer a smorgasbord of exploration, RPG systems, party customization.
Yeah, the car was so amazing. The reason why Final Fantasy 15 had the car, because the environments were completely empty. Like, this idea that Final Fantasy 15 is in any way better than 16 is so ridiculous to me. Like, the entire reason why you had like those boys like pushing the car is because you needed to traverse the environment faster. Granted, I never got to the point where I made the car fly, so who knows, maybe that changes everything.
Very linear, very narrow, very dour, and in my view, not a lot of fun.
Oof. Like, that is so weird. Not a lot of fun. SkillUp. God, that game is so beautiful.
Final Fantasy 16 tells the story of Clive Rosfield, a firstborn princeling who did not inherit the power that was his birthright. He was meant to be a dominant, a human being able to summon a powerful
He can be my dominant, right?
Clive's kingdom is protected by the Phoenix icon, and had Clive inherited its power, it would have given him the strength to guarantee
those
the
fights are so freaking epic.
other realms while he served as king. That power, though, skipped Clive, resting instead with his younger brother, Joshua. Rather than be crestfallen, Clive accepts his lot rather gladly, choosing to instead pledge himself as one of his brother's shield.
Yes, I would say that's the way that, like, it's true. Like, he is very positive towards Joshua, and I actually wouldn't have minded if we saw like some kind of like hidden jealousy from him. Not like an ugly kind, but just the kind that kids have towards other kids that might be more talented at them or something like that. Yet Clive, like, yes, Clive accepted his role, but Clive was also like, he was loved by his father. Like, he was loved by Joshua. He had an awesome dog. He had Jill. Like, yeah, he had the bitch. I will refrain from using more words than bitch. Mom, but everything else in his life was going well. So, while yes, you could make the point that maybe he shouldn't have been like so eager to just be Joshua's shield, I would argue in some ways it makes sense for a well-adjusted character, which in the end he is.
One day, though, tragedy befalls House Rosfield, and Clive finds himself cast from his homeland and on a bloody path of vengeance. Along the way, Clive is united with Sid, the dominant of lightning god Ramu, and together they put themselves on a collision course with not only the great houses and nations of their continent, Valisthea, but also the legendary icons that protect them and the mother crystals that are the source of each nation's power. If there's one thing I really love about Final Fantasy XVI, it's this world. Valisthea is
Glad
such a
to see
fascinating
SkillUp
location,
calling
truly
that
one of the
out
best ever Final
positively.
Fantasy worlds in my view. It is so deeply political in its construction. You have this landmass divided into kingdoms, each of them ruled by a different faction with their own architecture, faiths, belief systems, and their own unique relationship to the dominants and icons that protect them. Dominants are themselves fascinating. They are vessels for these all-powerful deities, and you might imagine that that gives them license to rule, or at least affords them a revered place in society. But the life of a dominant is often one of servitude, either willing...
Yeah, this is obviously not a criticism towards SkillUp. Just like, I will spoil some general understanding of the game, hopefully also to add credence to the fact that like I actually understand the game and like it. It's actually very interesting in that regard, which is it definitely does give them license to rule, right? Like the Rossfields are like the dominants of the Phoenix, and they rule over Rosaria. Like I believe his name is Dion. I'm bad with names sometimes. Sorry about that. I ask my patients. I forget their names all the time. But like the dominant of Bahamut, like he is a prince. So obviously Clive himself, who for some other reasons is a dominant, is part of the family. And Jill, I will comment on that. It's a spoiler sort of, but it's very early in the game and it's shown here, which is, yes, Jill is part of like a bad of like a country that treats dominants poorly, but at the same time it also becomes clear that those who are in the family of the dominant are rulers. So there is some abuse going on with the dominants, but overall I wouldn't say like, if a dominant like lets him or herself get mistreated, that's sort of one point, but it's very clear that society definitely gave a lot of leeway to like those basically like demigods.
Or reluctantly, and some cultures go as far as to enslave their dominants, believing them to be unclean aberrations. Then there's the icons themselves, each of them pulled from the Final Fantasy summons that many of us would know and love, and each of them being so singularly powerful that they serve as a form of mutually assured destruction. Sure, you could summon your icon and march it into the enemy capital, but the enemy would do the same, and where would that leave you? Your capital razed to the ground, the very earth beneath it torn asunder.
I would argue that this is probably why the dominants are somewhat treated poorly, but not as revered as one might say, because there is a strong implication in this game that this mutually assured destruction, which obviously is an allegory to the nuclear arming in the after the Second World War, during the Cold War, it's also partially why like even like people with like low magical abilities are treated poorly. I think it's implied that people really hated all the loss and damage that could be caused by those systems. So instead of like learning to deal with them in a productive way, they use them for one as nukes to scare off other nations, and the people that they could like defeat because of like they are more normies than bearers basically, like they enslaved them because they feared and hated them. And it's actually not a this common phenomenon for people to hate their slaves because they hate the powerlessness that they show. And it obviously makes sense for a person to want to have like a magic person be their slave than for a magic person to automatically like rule over them. I would say the metaphor to like real life slavery doesn't always work perfectly, but that's also because it's more of a Japanese and not a Western game. So their perception of like slavery is not entirely limited to like chattel slavery, which is like how Africans were treated as they were enslaved by the British, the Spanish, etc., and then like sold off to places like the US. I would argue that like they do have a perception of slavery that works in stories that aren't quite as black and white as what we usually do when we try to portray slavery, because not to defend slavery, but this is how like other cultures think of it a little differently. I myself live in Germany. I have friends in the US. I hate everything in regards to slavery, but I do understand that like even like Turkish people, for example, have a somewhat different perception of slavery because their own history of slavery, which was primarily like indebted servitude, also had elements where like children of slaves were not automatically slaves, and they even had like programs to bring in like children of slaves into like higher society to change up basically the foundations of society. So if anybody tries to say, oh, it's a bad allegory for slavery, it's a bad allegory for slavery if you are exclusively like thinking in a very neoliberal Western way. If you are thinking of it more complexly and all the nuances, especially of like a society that is medieval as a setup, then you will find that this allegory works better. But that does require a little bit more general knowledge, and especially of like Eastern cultures, than I think many people are willing to collect.
Of innocent lives lost. Icons are to Valisthea what nuclear weapons are to our world.
Okay,
and the usage is less about their capabilities or efficiency.
Thanks for
and more
agreeing
about
with me,
the
SkillUp.
incalculable cost of using them. The fire that sets this world to boil, though, are the mother crystals. These are massive formations, some of them as large as mountains, and they provide the world with the ether needed to power the various magics on which Valisthea's citizens rely.
Yeah, this is
though,
obviously where environmental allegories come
as a
in.
result, a blight has
I will not
befallen
even
vast
pause for
swathes of
that.
the
It's
land,
like it's a
shrinking
natural
kingdoms and
resources that
forcing
creates
them into
energy, and we
survival
exploit
mode.
it
They
and
look at
makes
their
the world
receding borders
worse.
and
Wow.
know that their foes are doing the same, not wanting to lose the initiative in the coming battle for resources and territory. This puts tensions at an all-time high, a powder keg awaiting just the right spark. What a great setup, huh? Isn't that cool? I think that's very cool. It's
It
also
is.
quite dry in a way that I think quite a few people may not love. This is a deeply political
That's a
game,
weird
not in a
complaint.
partisan
Yes, it's a
sense.
complex
In its
game,
focus
but
and
it
theme,
does a
its chapters
good
will
job
regularly
of
play out
explaining
in
itself.
sports, intense on the front lines of a battlefield, poring over maps, looking at troop movements and formations. The cast of this saga are kings and queens and courtesans and economic advisors. The game has an entire menu system set up to regularly explain the state of Valisthea's nations, the locations of their armies, their political goals, and their recent movements. It's almost grand strategy-esque at times. And if you're down for Machiavellian machinations and statecraft and palace intrigue and Napoleonic
Hell
style
yeah, I
forms of
am.
warfare, then you're gonna love this part of Final Fantasy 16. But if your eyes glaze over at the mere mention of this stuff,
But
Final
like,
Fantasy
what
16
what
is gonna
kind
be
of criticism is that? If you don't like the story type, you won't like this specific story, that applies to all stories. It's like saying, oh, if you don't like romance, it's like don't watch this rom-com, right? Or like Final Fantasy 15, if you don't like a couple of boys who are clearly in love with each other but won't admit it, which granted I am game for those kind of stories, no matter how hetero I am, like pushing a car, right? You won't love the story, fine. That's absolutely fine with me. Like, if you don't like it, you don't like it. But SkillUp in no way says that the story is actually poorly executed. There is some implication that like the second half doesn't work for him. But that's, and first of all, that's just your opinion, man. But granted, that's what reviews are for. But I would also argue that, like, what do you mean? Like, okay, but first of all, right now he only describes the first half, or basically the setup. But like, oh, but it's dry, right? That's the same like saying, oh, Game of Thrones is dry. But then people are like, oh, well, but Game of Thrones also has like sex and murder. Well, guess what? This game also have. It also has sex and murder. So please stop complaining about nothing.
Tough game to get through, I can promise you that. For me, though, I liked it. It's very similar to Final Fantasy XIV, another very political game that doesn't talk down to its audience and that trusts that they'll find verbal jousting just as thrilling as actual jousting. But Final Fantasy XIV, like other Final Fantasy games, isn't just its politics, it's also its unforgettable cast of characters. And this is one part of Final Fantasy XVI that really fails to deliver. The party has always been a central part of the Final Fantasy experience. The fireside chats, the sidebar conversations, the side quests to finish someone else's unfinished business. Party members were often more important.
But that's like part of storytelling. So like other Final Fantasies had like, I would say they had a larger cast of characters in the immediate vicinity of the main character. Like, obviously, Tifa and, what's the brown-haired girl? I always forget her name. Aerith, sorry. Like, Tifa for the win, guys, all the way. But, like, but then it's, like, buried, and then it's pretty much, that's the main cast. Yes, there are some more characters, but who can even freaking remember their names? Jesse, I believe one of them is Jesse. Oh, and then there is the thick kid. I like him because I'm thick myself. No, but like regardless, yes, I understand there is more of a party, but I would argue there are a lot of characters in the immediate vicinity of Clive. There is obviously Jill, which is his immediate love interest. There is Sid, especially in the beginning of the game, as through him you learn a lot more of the world, and he has badass powers himself. And then there are like less important characters like Gav and Tarja, who like one goes more in missions with you, the other doesn't, but that's obviously explained in the game. One is a healer, the other a fighter. There are just people that you meet in your hideouts that do have touching stories. That like there's like this scene where even with like Sid, but who like eats an apple that they grow there, or I don't know if it's like a special fruit, and they tell him, well, it's bitter, and he eats it, right? Because he loves what they created there, and he understands that a fruit has to be bitter before it gets sweet. And he understands how the work that he's putting into this will pay off in the end, and he's willing to support it with every fiber of his soul. Like a strong motivation, similar to how Barrett in, I believe that's his name, I'm sorry, like the gun guy in Final Fantasy VII, like who wants to protect the environment and stuff. And then throughout the second half of the game, there is a character joining your party who maybe you didn't think could join your party. And then there are all the enemies who are, unlike many other like games, they get a lot of like presence by themselves, like because of cutscenes, right? You do see a lot more of them, which, for example, in Final Fantasy VII Remake was very much missing. Like, you had, like, the corporation, and Sephiroth is, like, this ethereal, like, being who is there or isn't there. So I would argue that, like, Benedicta has a ton of great characterization. The dominant of the Titan, the dominant of Odin. Sorry, as I said, I'm bad with game. I believe the dominant of Odin is called Barnabas or something like that. Barnabas. And the dominant of the Titan is Hugo. Okay, so I do have some name memory in my head still. But like those are strong characters. Like even if they are more set up to be like dumb brute force, like Hugo, they are actually interesting characters because they clearly do have a motivation behind what they're doing. And then somebody like the dominant of Odin, who definitely does have strong motivations, I would say, even though they do kind of get revealed a little bit differently throughout the game. Again, no spoilers, but like this idea that good storytelling has to come through like your immediate party members, that's just your opinion, man, because clearly a lot of stories, including this one, can work well through a cast of characters that aren't necessarily as physically close to you, even though some are very physically close.
And the main characters, as Final Fantasy leads, were often gruff, non-communicative, edgy boys, or literally silent in the case of Final Fantasy XIV. We know that things were going to be slightly different here in 16 because Clive essentially fights alone. We never control other party members in combat. So
yeah, that's a different element. Like
centrality
God of
of
War
the
doesn't let
party.
you
What I didn't expect
control
was that the
like
absence of
much of
party members
Atreus.
would carry over to
You
the
actually
narrative
have
side of the game as
more
well.
control here of Torgal than you do with Atreus, because Torgal can attack and he can heal you, and then you also have like your potions and stuff. Which, by the way, I actually like the control scheme. I don't know. Some people have said they don't like it much. I actually like it a lot. I connected through it with it far better than something like Bayonetta. So yeah, like this idea that you have to control your characters around you, I don't get it. Like that's not what many games are doing. Why does this one have to do it? Because it's Final Fantasy? Like,
Clive does have some people around him who might, in a loose sense, be called a party. Only one or two of them are what we might actually refer to as party members, but they come and go a lot, and one of them really doesn't offer much. The other people around Clive
I
kind of just
assume he
hangers-on.
means
They seem
Gaff.
to do busy work like scout ahead or stay in the workshop building things. There was one moment in the game where it was rallying everyone for the next big push, and it was meant to be this
Yes,
emotional scene that creates this
Let's
feeling
get through
of
this.
camaraderie between everyone. And in any other Final Fantasy game, that scene would be thick with like 8 to 10 people, each of them these elaborately designed iconic party members with rich backstories and so much more to share as you journey forth with them. Here, this scene had one actual party member and like 3 hangers-on and the town vendor. For real, they roped the vendor in to pad this scene out because
it's like,
the
yes, I know the way SkillUp shows this actually looks like that's what's happening. Yes, this is sort of a moment before there's like a major like story beat, but that's like 60% into the game. When I originally watched this review, I watched it actually before I played the game. So if anything, my perception of the game should be more negative, because I was like more primed with like a more negative review. It's like, well, that's not true. I played like the demo and then I watched this review. Like that is so not what is happening here. It's just a small like meeting, like not even between friends. They discuss like a few more plans, but in the end it's very much clear that like Clive is doing like 99% of the work. Again, no disrespect to Jill, it's actually explained, which is like Jill was forced to be fighting with Shiva. She like the ice icon, right? And she didn't want to, she was forced to, and she engaged in those like large fights, including one in the very beginning against Titan, but she killed hundreds of people literally with her powers and stuff like that. And it's told in the game that bearers basically turn into stone as they use their powers. And as it gets confirmed through the game, the same can apply to dominance. It seems to work differently, like per character. So there obviously are like some limitations. Maybe it also has like to do with like your psyche. This is magic. I don't want magic to always make perfect sense. I think it makes sense given the characters that we see. Clive, who we find out is a dominant, does not actually use his powers that much. And in the time skip that happens, it's very much explained afterwards that during that time skip, he relied on her to do a lot of like big dominant work. And I don't mean in the bedroom. So the difference here is that by the end of the game, she cannot fight quite as much, because that curse that like normal bearers have also applies to her, that if whenever she overdoes her powers, not only does she like get weak, needs a lot of sleep, that happens with a lot of like magical stories and stuff, but that she would turn into stone if she like exerted all her powers at once for like several hours again or something like that. So basically her powers are bursty and with a long cooldown. Joke based on her being an ice princess. But yeah, like there are story explanations for why Clive fights alone most of the time. Even Sid, who is a dominant, is also very much shown that he is not a young man anymore, and that he struggles to do more than like one giant attack. He has like good control of his powers, but he doesn't have like unlimited like stamina. So this is the characters that you have. Like, what do you want? How many? Like, I, for example, am somebody who like sort of liked Benedicta in the sense that I would have actually liked to see her like be redeemed. But then I thought about it, and then I thought like, oh, then we would have like 4 freaking dominants right at the beginning of the game. Like, that doesn't seem like and kind of underdog group. Even there are like scenes where it's like Sid, Jill, and Clive, and they're like, oh man, we are really outnumbered here. And I'm like, you're literally like 3 of the 7 strongest. It's technically 8. Technically it's 9, because there are like 8 dominants, but one icon is like lost. It's like Leviathan is not in the game, and then it's like it's like 7 regular icons and dominants, but then like Clive basically joins the game with Ifrit. Yeah, so it gets complicated, but you basically have like 1/3 of the world's nuclear arsenal in one spot, and you're complaining how outnumbered you are. Sorry guys, you are not. So actually making this group much larger also doesn't make story sense. This is what I'm trying to say. Like, the story works for me. So when the story gives explanation to certain gameplay elements, or like why there isn't like a large party or something like that, I accept it, because yeah, I'm engrossed in the story, and those elements would actually take me out of the story.
Is just so thin. For what it's worth, Clive absolutely delivers. He's not only the hottest protagonist the series has ever seen, spoiler excluded of course, but I also think he's the best voiced. Ben Starr gives an absolutely
awesome guy, awesome
Every
voice.
Single syllable pitch perfect. His portrayal of Clive paints him heroic yet humble, ferocious yet tender, and above all, deeply human. It is a good thing that Ben Starr is as talented as he is, because if he had faltered, then this entire game would have been doomed. But there's a limit to what Starr can do here, given how little other characters in the game challenge Clive or eke things out of him. Your party members in a Final Fantasy game were often there to bring out some new aspect of the main character. You'd have a different relationship with each member of your party, some of them being your love interest, your arch nemesis turned convenient ally, your mentor, a court jester, etc. Clive does not have those strong characters around him to push and pull him into different modes, and as such, Clive feels as dour and as one note as the rest of the game does.
No, he doesn't. I will not even comment on this. Like, to play the actual game, Clive is a nice guy who got really treated badly by a lot of his life. He tries to stay positive, but mostly what he can do is fight, and he puts his power into helping others. And there are moments when he melts a little as like his facade gets broken, because finally somebody else cares about him for once. And when like Jill shows him that she also is game, I cannot not spoil it, like no matter how I phrase it, then like he says like, I never knew that a smile could bring me such joy, and it's such a tender, loving moment. And then yes, in the normal game he has to get back to a more stoic self, because so does Jill, so does everybody else but Sid, who's like older. He doesn't take things as seriously, but and then there's characters who are a little differently raised, I would say, because they had like a different sense of themselves, just like more royalty. So, but even then, like Dion, I believe he's called Dion, is like a much more tender person than one might think of, like the dominant of Bahamut. So yeah, like I don't agree that like Clive is as one dimensional as the rest. Yeah, the rest. If you tell me that the others aren't one dimensional and Clive isn't one dimensional, is as one dimensional in terms of like not as they are, then I would agree. But so no.
About how much this game leaves behind the Final Fantasy legacy, and this party thing is one of the biggest deal breakers for me. I could deal with Clive being the only controllable character in combat, though to be honest, that is pretty disappointing. But for Clive to not be surrounded by deep, interesting companions, that is a massive oversight, and it's one of the many things that makes this feel a lot less Final Fantasy than any mainline entry I've played. So that's the stage set, a continent at war, the icons each a loaded gun, the mother crystals pushing armies towards one another, and at the center of it all, Clive and his quest for vengeance. How then does all of this play out? Or more specifically, how does it play? Well, I hope you like cutscenes.
Again, like, what does that mean? Yeah, I do like cutscenes. Also, one of those things wasn't a cutscene.
At least around 40 hours, capping out at around 70 hours for completionists. So, what are you doing in that 40 to 70 hours? Well,
this game isn't 40 hours. That is part of my complaint. That game doesn't take you 40 hours.
Quest line,
unless you suck.
A bit of side content here or there, you should know that approximately 75% of this game is cutscenes. That is not an exaggerated number at all, by the way. It is actually 75% of the time that you put down the controller and you just watch the show.
The problem is like those interactions with like, I assume like, when he originally said it's like 80% cutscene, and I said that's wrong. I assume he also counts like those interactions with like characters that would, in more traditional Final Fantasy games, wouldn't be cutscenes, but they would be like text boxes underneath what is happening, right? And I don't even mean like in this like, oh, we looking into each other's eyes, but it would be like, well, not a top view, but like, you know what I mean, right? Especially in like the Chibi era, like you would be further away and then you would see the text underneath. That technically wouldn't be a cutscene, but guess what? Neither is this actually a cutscene, because to me a cutscene is something that like you cannot fast forward to. You can skip a cutscene, but you cannot fast forward through a cutscene. Through most interactions that you have with characters in the world, you will actually find, unless it's more an important interaction and it does become a cutscene even inside the side quest, that you can like tap the X button and then you go through to the next line. And if you're a fast reader, then you can cut those interactions to basically nothing. And if you see that it's like a somewhat boring side quest or something like that, well, guess what? You can skip it almost entirely and still get all like, you can then read about it in like the settings, basically, like what your actual quest is. So I completely disagree that it's like 75% cutscene. No, like it also depends like how much you actually run through the game. Maybe you want to challenge all enemies. There are like marks, they're called, which are like strong enemies throughout the environment, that have like bounties on them and stuff like that. Those don't have anything to do with cutscenes, unless you want to tell me that like 3 lines of like a side character who like gives you some information on them are cutscenes. So yeah, I disagree.
For many, 75%. That is going to be a deal breaker. They're going to be like, "Come on, bro, let me play the game." And I think that's a perfectly valid.
No, not once did I feel that it stops me from actually playing the game.
Having said that,
Unless you
it's
don't
actually
like
not a deal
anybody
breaker
around
for
you.
me. As I mentioned earlier, Final Fantasy XIV's MSQ is like 90% cutscenes, and I'm okay with it for a lot of different reasons, too numerous to fully recount here. Metal Gear games, some of my favorite games, and they certainly don't shy away from lengthy cutscenes, particularly
Yeah.
Xenoblade games, particularly Xenoblade 3, that has some seriously long but seriously awesome cutscenes. Final Fantasy VII Remake, plenty of cutscenes there too.
Yeah, I
Most
dislike.
involve
I
going on dates with
liked
Tifa. Not gonna lie, had absolutely no problem with
pacing in Final Fantasy VII Remake less than I did here. So that's my cup of
The point
tea.
I'm trying to make here is that heavy
my
reliance on
2
cutscenes
cents.
isn't inherently a bad thing. It always depends on how much those cutscenes deliver and how they feel when set against the total experience that the game is offering. For me, personally, Final Fantasy XVI's use of cutscenes is laborious, indulgent, and extremely outdated. This
Yeah,
game
so
has
that's
no
just your
interest in
opinion,
trying
man.
to
You
maintain
didn't say
the illusion
anything.
of playability. It just surrenders itself to this lopsided seesaw where you push through these brief bursts of gameplay to be treated to an admittedly very exciting cutscene. After that though, you're pushed into this side quest style busy work that delights in drawn out exchanges and labored exposition without the charm of interesting characters or scenarios to make it endurable. I know that's a really damning assessment, but
And
the
it's also
lopsided
not
seesaw
true.
thing is so core to this experience, and you almost start to resent the high points because you know just how low things are going to get after that. To be able
Yeah,
to fully explain
I'm
that point-
sorry. Like, what does that even mean? Like, yeah, I certainly hated the Garuda fight because, like, I knew that I would later like collect some dirt for like to find out which soil is fertile for like the fruits we grow at the hideout. It's one of the more boring side quests, admittedly, and I have no problem in admitting that this game has faults. Did that have any freaking influence on like the Titan fight, which is like this world-ending fight over like several miles, like giant boulders being thrown at you, or like the Bahamut fight that goes into like freaking like the stratosphere of the planet, and you combine with another beep. And I'm sorry, I'm trying not to spoil anything, but like precisely why he doesn't show it, I think it's partially not just because it's spoiler alert, but because it would severely diminish his idea that any of those like somewhat lackluster environmental storytelling or like side stories, that they diminish the main quest. And as I said, there aren't that many like boring like small main quests. Yes, there usually is, like, I would argue, like 2 per like 1 major one. I would argue that there's probably like 1 that you do like for the hideout in general, and then maybe you do like a main quest that is more like a side quest to the main quest before setting it up, right? And what happens then is then you go to the main quest, I would argue, and that one is completely awesome. And yeah, some would say, oh, but it's like 2 to 1. Does that mean that it's like 66% or 33% bad to awesome? First of all, I wouldn't categorize those other things as bad unless you consider even something like Horizon Zero Dawn, which I would argue that Forbidden West got way better with its side quests and way better with like its character animations. I would say this game is closer to Horizon Zero Dawn in that regard than to something like Forbidden West. No, it's not 66% bad, 33% great. That's just not. I know it's sort of implied also with what he says, and I try to put it into like basically my experience numerically, but I simply cannot agree with the idea that like there is some monotony that like negatively affects your perception of the overall great central story. That's just not at all how I felt.
Though I think I first need to explain how Final Fantasy XVI is structured. So the first part of the game is essentially the demo that you've probably played. It's a flashback sequence, strictly linear, and frankly,
I'm getting
very
myself a
introduction
Coke,
to the game,
guys.
because it does a
Right
fantastic
back.
job of
I will
establishing the
listen
world,
to
the main characters,
AirPod.
and Clive's motivation in his quest for vengeance. After that, the game opens up quite a bit, and there's a base of operations called the Hideaway, and it's here you'll be able to pick up side quests, visit the vendor and the blacksmith, and plan your next move. When you've decided where you want to go, you can open up the world map and a number of nodes appear. Some of these nodes will be for semi-open world maps where you can complete main and side quests, and the other nodes will be for your marquee main mission locations. These are strictly linear environments and feel very similar to the levels you'd find in Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, essentially a set of combat arenas connected by some
So everything SkillUp has said thus far, I don't disagree with, so it's fine for me to get a coke during it.
Missions are the high point of the game, but even then, I still struggle with them. They're meant to be these gripping showdowns between hero and villain. They're meant to bring matters to a bloody head. They're meant to serve as the precursor to the icon battles, where your deities will duel to the death. Despite all of that, these missions are always just running through some corridors, killing some low-level bad guys, and then waiting for the cutscenes to advance the story. There's no scenario design in any of these missions, no variation that makes one feel different from...
Yeah, and to throw SkillUp a little bit of a bone, I actually don't disagree with that. I would argue a little bit that that has a lot to do with it being a Japanese game. And from a lot of experience with Japanese games, going through a corridor, killing a low-level enemy, to then meet an enemy that is like a god level of those enemies, kind of is a staple of a lot of Japanese games. So, and he even mentioned like Devil May Cry, which obviously is like the biggest inspiration for this, but like, yeah, that's how it works. And I know that it's like somewhat monotonous and it's maybe not what you would expect in Final Fantasy. But guess what? Final Fantasy historically also has a lot of its own monotony and a lot of its own pacing issues, which again, I don't agree that this one does, but this idea that this is somewhat different, like it does things differently than most other Final Fantasy games, but I would argue that the final result is actually very similar.
Another, swap out the architecture and skyboxes, and these missions all feel functionally the same. But they do culminate in
these epic
showdowns.
And yeah, that's how it works.
You are not ready for just how epic these icon battles are. They are absolutely fucking incredible to behold. Incredible. Anyone who has played Final Fantasy XIV will know how big this team can go when it comes to spectacle. This is an entirely new level for this team. And when you see these battles, they will absolutely blow your mind. You genuinely have not seen anything like this before. As impressive as all these showdown moments are, they are also the least playable. They're reliant on a simplified combat model that offers no challenge, and they also include these QTEs that have these absurdly long input times to the point where you wonder why they included them at all. These are really amazing battles to look at, but their beauty is skin deep, and it's disappointing that the biggest cinematic and emotional climaxes that Final Fantasy XVI has to offer are also its cheapest thrills. What makes it worse is that when these massive showdowns happen and these cataclysmic events unfold, the fade to black presages a good 2 to 3 hours of you kind of just fucking around doing some main story quests that feel like side quest busy work. That's the other side of the seesaw.
Okay.
Into the
so I've already commented on the latter thing, right? Which I said I agree to, that there is like a cost to like those main storylines. Then there come some main storylines that feel a little more like side stories. What do I disagree with? Now, he says that those icon battles are skin deep. That does not apply to like the latter ones. Like Bahamut was like, I wouldn't call it like really difficult because I don't think this game is designed to be like really difficult. I assume it's really difficult in Final Fantasy level. Oh, sorry. But it's not Elden Ring or like any FromSoft game. Like it's not designed to be like super difficult and like the regular like you/me, I/you fight. So yes, where he is correct is that there is a simplification of controls in the icon battles. However, that also isn't quite true as you progress through the game because you gain some extra moves with the icons that do more resemble your usual portfolio of attacks. But yes, it does have to do with game progression. So maybe something like the Garuda fight, which is one of the first ones in the game, feels really basic. However, and that is a big, big but, which is that the icon battles are usually like the second stage of your fight with the dominant of that icon, which includes usually a very interesting fight, which has a lot of like FromSoft, I would argue, characteristics, which is like you in one room arena with one enemy. They have like a specific move set. I know it applies to basically all games, but FromSoft is like the easiest metaphor. And like instead of like dodge roll, you have like your R1 dodge, and while dodging, instead of giving you iframes, it gives you like the ability to hit the enemy. In that it even has like some parry stuff that is very hard to pull off. But you don't really need it, and you find like which moves work better on them. Again, there are some RPG elements lacking that I will criticize, but like there are some moves some enemies that you would want to attack more from afar, some from mid, some from close range. On some, you just want to unload your entire arsenal. Some you really want to make sure that they're staggered so you can get the biggest individual combo, as they cannot protect or cannot dodge you while they are stunned. So they are, especially if you play in the like more difficult way, which again I think it was a mistake of the game to not offer like Final Fantasy difficulty, especially since the Final Fantasy since New Game Plus also seems to have like more like mid-level bosses with interesting movesets. But again, that's also pretty typical for a lot of games in like this kind of genre, where it's like, yeah, we hit like SkillUp just said, oh, there isn't much to do but the story, the combat, and the characters. Well, guess what? If you enjoyed those things, you can replay that game, but now with higher difficulty and more interesting enemies throughout the world. I don't think that's a bad thing, especially if you're somebody who already planned to play the game 2 or 3 times.
World to do work that is absolutely beneath a man of Clive's considerable abilities. Local pickpockets are on the prowl. Someone better track them down by asking lots of questions in town. Oh, some bandits are raiding a village. Better go stop them. One of the working ladies from the brothel is missing. Could you go and ask like 4 people what's up with that and then report back? I kid you not. At one
Clive is a good character. He doesn't judge the tasks he is suggested with. Yes, some of those are forced, but especially in like the side characters, he doesn't say like, oh no, like I hate you, you lowly peasant. Like he's somebody who like lived through 12, 13 years of being a slave. Oh my god, he was 12 years a slave. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for putting it into that kind of sentence. But like, he is basically a character that does not consider to him either physical, either like power-wise or like status-wise above the other characters. So yes, somebody might say, oh, but it doesn't work in the game. Yeah, it does. Like, because he does have those bombastic moments where he basically is a demigod. But it's also very clear that, like, being in, like, their human form does not give them, like, superhuman strength or, like, yes, they can, like, empower themselves with, like, maybe, like, a move that makes them faster based on, like, their icon. And Clive obviously has, like, different icon powers, so he is the most versatile. But, like, dominants are not by themselves like gods all the time. So if you like went up to one who was sleeping and tried to slit their wrist, like their throat, it would work, because it's not like they are like Superman all the time.
I just felt a mighty icon in what was one of the most mind-blowing boss showdowns I've ever seen in my life, And then immediately after that, like literally 5 minutes after that, I was being tasked by the town engineer to go and collect lumps of dirt.
Yeah, it was the main
So
story. I
walking
didn't
by this
remember it.
riverbed,
I thought it was a
collecting
side
dirt
story that I
after
just agreed
having
to.
vanquished a god. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, come on, man, is this your first RPG? This is how these games go.
Yeah.
It can't all be 300 miles an hour. You got to have
Yes.
some 60 zones. And that's
Yes.
true. I agree. There is a way to do that, and I promise you, Final Fantasy XVI does not get it right. These lows are so low and so boring that I can see scores of people just being unable to push through them. These swings between high and low are so vast that it feels like you're playing two totally different video games. One of them, this relentless breakneck AAA action blockbuster, and the other...
But like what you showed right now, like as a representation of like a breakneck action blockbuster, that was a scene that you can find throughout the game like 100 times. Like this is not something like that enemy, that Akashic enemy, which is basically like a being that has like been juiced up full of ether. There are some of them in like main and side stories, and sometimes you just move through a story, whether you're going through your next main or side mission, and then you fight those, and they're interesting to fight, and some of them are in groups, and sometimes there will be like sometimes you will find also as part of like the Mark quest where there are like those hidden small bosses. Sometimes one of them will be a boss, surprisingly. You don't actually have to confirm a task like on the board where you are like finding those enemies. It's difficult to explain. You will see it in the game. I highly recommend you play the game. But yeah, so this idea that like this is like representative of like super highs that you will experience like very rarely, that's not true. Like the combat itself feels great, and as you update also like your individual attacks, which is very RPG, you will see like different moves, and some of them will go from like a 3x combination to a 5x combination. Like highly recommend like the Odin setup. It's really satisfying once you can like do like 1,000 slashes in the air to an enemy. So yeah, I just don't agree.
Fast that it feels like you're playing two totally different video games. One of them, this
as I said, I don't disagree that there is a disconnect between those two modes. I just don't think that one makes the other part less impressive and less impactful.
Linear combat gauntlets, and the side missions are, yeah, they're basically just fetch quests, man. They're really,
yes, they
really
are
bad.
No, they're not.
Deliver these packages to these three people. Go and collect some scorpion parts. I need some wax for my boat. So go get it.
Yeah, okay, that
flower.
was
The
silly.
story setup is dull. What you are doing is dull.
Yeah, but
and the
like
rewards are effectively non-existent since there's basically no.
But like again, like is there like no story interest for you to like like this story? This is a main story mission in terms of like that you have to get done, but it doesn't impact the main story overall. But it's like a story quest that you get from like the lady of the bordel of the town. I believe it's called like that. I don't want to call it a whorehouse. So she is the leader of that local establishment, and one of her girls has either run off or has been kidnapped or something like that. And we find out through some machination that she had a boyfriend who got jealous for actually no reason. Then something bad happened, and now they're both dead. It's not quite a Romeo and Juliet story, but I would say like the conclusion was actually interesting to find out. Again, it's very slice of life until it isn't, until it actually gets kind of effed up and some of it gets really dark. And I would wish that they would eliminate like 30% of the side quests that aren't that good. But yes, it's, as I said, it's a monotony to how those quests are set up. But I disagree with the idea that makes them inherently bad.
and progression in this game. It's some of the worst side quest design I've seen in a long time. In the absence of meaningful rewards or interesting scenario design, I'm all but certain that side quests exist primarily as a narrative exposition tool. They house these little side stories that are meant to broaden out the world, and that's a perfectly noble goal. The problem is that you're already spending so much time in cutscenes in the main quest, listening to exposition, and to have to sit through even more cutscenes.
But you don't have to sit through them in side quests. But yes, this is how this world is set up. Somebody gives you a reason to do something, then you go and do that shit. And it's not perfect, it's not super modern. Once again, I would say that like a game like God of... Yes. Okay, I will listen to this.
Better blend storytelling and gameplay, be it through companions or environmental storytelling or scenario design or whatever.
God of War is literally one of the best games ever made. Star Wars Jedi Survivor sucks in comparison to this.
That have cutscenes, they're also able to advance their stories while
Resident Evil doesn't have side quests. Like, I know that's not true. I know it does have like optional stuff, but like you cannot compare like the main missions.
To all of this is what I said at the start of this block. Cutscenes are not in and of themselves bad, and heavy reliance on them is not in and of itself bad. This year I played and loved Like a Dragon Ishin. That comment about the story standing still when the controller is in hand, I think you could say the same thing of Ishin, and most Yakuza games really.
Vito, I see your comment. I actually don't disagree that I need some graphic designer, but I think I will wait for that until like I actually have a firm grasp on what content I'm doing, because I don't want to like get people involved until I actually have something more substantial here. But thank you for commenting.
It does have some semi-open world areas. There are essentially 2 of them for the first 30 or so hours of the game. There's a big green field, and then many hours later there's a big desert. Each of these spaces are analogous to the spaces you'd find in an old school MMO. Like, you wouldn't find spaces like this in modern day World of Warcraft, for example. These spaces here are big, they are flat, they are absent any explorable landmarks, they are peppered with only a very small handful of enemies just standing out in the open waiting for you to come and kill them. These spaces offer nothing in terms of exploration, surprise dungeons, worthy loot, chance encounters with NPCs who may be able to join your party or make themselves felt in some meaningful way throughout your journey. There is just nothing out there, man. Absolutely nothing. You get chocobos in this game, and it's like, why?
It's not that empty. Like,
makes sense in the context of bigger spaces.
Those areas are basically like, it's like an interactive like map, I would argue. Like, yes, there are like corridors essentially that take you from A to B, but are they essentially? They're beautifully designed environments. They present you with people that are there that might offer you side quests. There are some items thrown around it, and there are enemies to both level up in a more RPG sense, right? Some of you want to grind. And beyond that, there is the element of just also like finding the stronger enemies and finding just out how the environment has like, maybe you get like told, oh, this area was beautiful, but then you like wander through like something that was completely destroyed by the blight, and it's like basically like dark dirt only. And yeah, so this idea that it's like nothing, basically, that's not true, but it does serve more the story than it does like an itemization RPG system, because that game simply doesn't prioritize it, which is fine, because not every game needs to have that.
Spend more time in these spaces, exploring them, but you absolutely do not. The only reason to venture out into them is to follow the side quest marker so you can kill the 3 firebombs so that the water in the local baths isn't so hot anymore. Thank you very much for your service. Here's 100 gil and 0 XP. Again, think about how much level and world design has evolved.
Was that 0 XP per mission? Well, I guess because you get XP from the enemies,
like
right?
Traveling back in time like 20 years. You've got this really linear game in the main missions. Essentially Devil May Cry style gameplay where you're just being shuttled from combat arena to combat arena.
Since when has linear... Like, this is where I will actually be really, really like bad towards reviewers, which is like, I understand that like it does feel a little outdated. However, why does it feel outdated? Well, because the more contemporary games do feel more like Ubisoft style open world games, even if they're like semi open world. And yes, there are games that I would argue manage it perfectly. Like God of War is a perfect semi-open world game. Something like Breath of the Wild is more like of a perfect open world game because it focuses more on the environment than it does the story. So what happens then is if you have a game that is undeniably linear and is using the environment to tell you a little bit about the world, but mainly move you through the world in a beautiful way to your next mission, it gets criticized. So, of course, some developers will then feel the need to just push unnecessary bullshit into the world, and somebody would be like, oh, why isn't there like an interesting waterfall, which behind it I can find a never seen before enemy and a great reward item. Yes, that would be cool, and this would, as I said in the beginning, this is like a 9 out of 10 game for me. And if it had like side story missions that I would give it a 10. However, the absence of such stuff does not make it like a bad game in the way that SkillUp implies. Like, the main story is so high quality, the main missions with like the pay off missions, right, not like the necessarily all the smaller stuff, are also high quality. They have all such a great story payoff, not like items. This is not Diablo. I don't need like a million items to shower me every time I kill an enemy.
Open world areas were the opportunity for Square to do something, to do anything to mix things up, to offer a different pattern of play that felt distinct from those main missions, or perhaps recreate at least a little of some of what you felt when you flew your airship around the overworld map back in the day. Again, coming back to my intro, I talked about how much this new Final Fantasy experience leaves behind in its pursuit of the new hotness. Final Fantasy games haven't always gotten exploration right.
This game feels 20 years old because it pursues new hotness. Like character action games, famous for having been invented like last year or something like that.
But it's always been a core tenet of the series. The world was meant to be bigger than you. It was meant to be full of surprising things to discover. Final Fantasy XVI's world, Valisthea,
yeah, it meant there's actually a big story explanation for why a lot of the world is not ripe for exploration. There's actually a big environmental reason for this. But regardless of it, this game is already so large that asking for it to be filled with a ton of world changing elements, it kind of would break the game. This is the definition of feature creep. That, sure, if that game had another 5 years in development and maybe was launching on the PS6 by that point, sure, sounds awesome. Is that really what we want to see in an era where most games now take up 5 or 6 years of development anyway, if you were talking about big ambitious AAA titles? I kind of don't think so.
Feels like you could fit it in a thimble, and there isn't a square inch of it worth dismounting to see. Combined with the poor side quests, the uneven pacing of the main quest, the repetitiveness of the core mission design, and the over-reliance on cutscenes, Final Fantasy XVI is a real slog, and as good as its combat
it's not
is,
a slog.
It's not nearly good enough to save it. So by now, we all know that one of Capcom's best combat designers, Ryota Suzuki, was poached by Square Enix to lead the combat design here in Final Fantasy XVI. He's most known for his work on Devil May Cry, but he also worked on Dragon's Dogma and even Marvel vs. Capcom 2, still the greatest soundtrack in the history of video games. The goal for having the likes of Suzuki on board was to deliver a cutting-edge character action experience, but one that was accessible to newcomers who perhaps haven't played this type of game before.
Again, this is also something I have a question for. Why does it need to be cutting edge? what does that mean? Like, yeah, if you ask me, like, do I like this game style like more than I do turn-based? Yes. Do I like it more than something like God of War or Ghost of Tsushima? No, I do like those games more. But it's a choice, right? You like, if you get the DMC guy, you will get DMC-esque gameplay, and I like this actually more than I do a DMC. At least DMC 5. That's the only one I played truly, and like I tried the HD remasters and like the PS3. That's not. I'm not trying to be like an ass here, but it's like, oh, but why they got him to do it, to make it accessible? Yes, because they're targeting a wide audience. I understand that point, but what do you mean when you say, oh, they got him to make a cutting edge one? Do you mean that it has to be the best one ever made? It definitely is my favorite out of anything in the genre I've tried. Does it mean it has to be more difficult? Because then that kills accessibility. Though, again, there is another difficulty option in the New Game Plus. So there is one criticism to that gameplay that I have that I actually cannot blame on the core design, but I will get to that. But this idea that it's like...
I think Suzuki.
I try not to be too angry here.
I think this is a good combat system, but I also think it lacks the mechanical depth of dedicated character action games, and I think it lacks the strategic depth that was often the staple of more RPG-based combat systems. I think
so. Again, yeah, like the depth, I think fundamentally comes down to like crazy ass combos. And maybe like DMC is more difficult by default, which would imply that you have to get better and actually learn those combos. I think people who actually get really far into the game and actually try to get to like sort of 100%, they will find out that there is a lot of depth and that you do have to master it if you actually want to master the more difficult enemies. Like, try to replay the levels in the arcade mode and try to get rid of some of your like not just like your super like powered up stuff from like the easy mode, but try to get rid of the stuff that reduces like cooldown, and you will find out that suddenly you have to be a master of like great like jumps and combos, and where you really have to make every dodge count, and where you have to really learn how to like combine a lot of damage into the stun time of the enemy, because throughout the rest of it the enemy might like be flying freaking around and shooting at you, so you won't even have as much of a chance to damage them unless you're using specific icon powers that you might not always even have equipped. Try switching between like icons. That's one criticism that I have, that you always have like 3 icon powers equipped. I wish you could like have maybe like 4, so that you always would have like half of them at your disposal, which technically you sort of get close to it because Ifrit and the Phoenix share one slot. But yeah, I do think that like one more would have hit the sweet spot for me.
The game's overall structure and length, where the time between new ability unlocks can be upwards of 5 to 8 hours.
Yeah, so I got through the game relatively quickly, so, and I'm not even that good, so
that approachability angle. It is masterfully designed to welcome in new players and get them feeling like badasses really fast. The basic combo animations look sweet, the dodge windows are generous, the witch time slowdown is very slow, and the activated
I think this complaint is a little bit how like some reviewers will complain that like Pokemon is too easy, and some people will say, but Final Fantasy is not Pokemon. Yeah, guess why it's not Pokemon? It's an adult story, it has a ton of production value, it's a very polished game, it has adult themes, and it even got like from the ground up like a new like gameplay. It always tries to innovate. That's how it's not Pokemon. But guess what? Accessibility is important, and that's how Pokemon stays one of the most popular franchises ever. And to find something that a lot of people can easily connect with and feel like badasses is important.
elaborately animated moves with custom camera work that slow down and frame the action. It never stops being super satisfying to execute some of the bigger haymakers because the sights, the sounds, and the feedback are all totally on point. Those abilities are the bedrock of combat. There's no swappable weapons, there's no variation to your basic melee or ranged attacks. There are just these abilities. You can equip up to 6 of them, as well as
He showed
3
one
utility
ring of
abilities,
8.
stuff like a long dash or a grapple or an enhanced parry, etc. Those
Yes.
6 damaging abilities don't require any resource build, they're just on timers, and since basic attacks do so little damage, combat is ultimately
But there
focused
are
on
items
pushing out as
that
many of those
change
abilities
those
as possible,
timers.
cycling through the 6 of them as soon as they're off cooldown. So I want to be clear that there's plenty of expression possible in this combat system if you work to unearth it. What I mean by that is there are lots of abilities that have very singular use cases that can add depth to combat, but they're also less efficient than other ability options. A good example is a move that dispels projectiles and allows you to counter after that. That's really cool, but there are very few enemies in the game who fling projectiles at you, and even when they do, they don't do a lot of damage. So you can equip that ability and stand back waiting for enemies to shoot something at you, or you can just equip another ability that does more damage more regularly in a larger area and is less situational. That's fine though, because
The
character
funny thing, I think I actually do have like that projectile thing equipped, because I simply like that it like pushes enemies away, so I can focus on like like do that to the enemies up front, and then I can turn around to the enemies behind me and I can damage or even defeat those, and then I can turn back to those enemies if I hadn't one-shot them.
action games are meant to have a range of different abilities that are just there to be used. It's not about
Yes.
efficiency, it's about expression and providing a skill ceiling that rewards time invested, practice, and ultimately mastery. Those
Yes.
looking for that sky-high skill ceiling, you won't find it here. Final Fantasy XVI's combat is so leveraged into its abilities that it forgoes things like directional inputs, weapon swapping, or infinite air juggle combos, or whatever, since ability timers are really short, about 8.
Yeah, like directional inputs it isn't more like if I do a combo up there, like up it's different than like left to right, it's different because there are some abilities that require you to aim, and just in general, like there is some strategy that for like, do I attack the smaller enemies first or do I deal with the big guy, which also involves like what is the state of your party members, are they actually useful?
50% of combat is dumping those abilities as soon as they're off cooldown, and they're
That's not wrong, but the mastery is what happens in like because it's like 90% of the damage that you deal has to do with like dumping all of your cooldown abilities onto the enemy. But it does, and I wish there was more RPG, and I wish SkillUp would get to that point, because it is something that I want to criticize myself. But in those 10%, which I wouldn't even say like 10%, in those other like 25, 30, 30%, like this is where you have to like do perfect dodges. Maybe you do like even some parries if you're really good. So it's like,
really isn't
it's
much
not as negative as SkillUp paints, and even though he says he likes
you can
it.
do outside of what those abilities let
Yeah,
you
that's
do.
it's an
Personally,
aiming
I found combat
ability.
to be really fun and flashy, but I also found it to be quite repetitive, and I really longed for a combat model that gave me more agency outside.
So yes, it is fun and flashy, and yes, it is definitely repetitive. One thing that is always part of like character action games in comparison to like very deep action games, like let's say something like Sekiro or Ghost of Tsushima, right, where it has a lot more riding on your talent. It doesn't give you necessarily all the versatility of the world, and you have to adapt very well to each individual enemy. That is not here. Not like, yes, there is some adapting to like the overall enemy variety and like how many enemies are there on screen, but like you obviously will do most of the time kind of the same stuff. And if this game actually had been 60 hours, which also means that its progression system that was based was spaced over like 60, was like over 20 hours for me, was now suddenly be spaced over 50 hours. And then you only have like 10 hours where you like fully powered up after 50 hours, where I would say I had like 5 hours as being mostly fully powered up after 20 hours. If we were talking about a Valhalla situation where you are doing like the same thing for 60 hours, this is a review that we very much agree with SkillUp. Yes, but again, this idea that like this game is so monotonous and like so poorly paced, because I don't agree with those, I cannot agree with many of his criticism towards the combat.
Just those equipped abilities. I also found it very easy. There's only one difficulty option on your strategic angle. Final Fantasy games have always reveled in their elemental magics, with enemies having certain weaknesses.
So before we get to this, I hope... Okay, so the video is working, okay. I'm sorry, I had to like reconnect, I had to connect to like my personal hotspot on my iPad. I think my router overheated because we have some like very hot days and very high humidity, so it dies like once a day, even though it's like a new premium router. I have no idea what's going on. Maybe it's like the overall internet connection itself that goes bad, but yeah, it seems to be working good. So let's get to a point that I actually agree with before we sort of go to wrapping it up.
Being resistant to others, there was white healing magic, destructive black magic, harnessing the magic of enemies through blue magic. There was buffs and debuffs. There was all sorts of stuff, and Final Fantasy XVI has absolutely none of that. That's not a huge deal, but at the same time, wouldn't it have been cool if you had to respec at the start of a boss because you knew that boss was weak to fire magic? Maybe it would have encouraged you to use some of those abilities you wouldn't otherwise use, push you to use those less efficient abilities because they're more efficient in the context of this boss's elemental weaknesses. It's also just kind of lame to be beating on a firebomb with fire magic.
Yes, that's the one point that I wholeheartedly agree with. This is the lamest part about the game. The idea that like elements don't play basically any role at all is, in my opinion, a little sad, and the fireballs were the most obvious part. Obviously, it kind of would break the game a little bit if like your magic-filled enemies couldn't be attacked with magic in general, but like especially the fire bombs, like yeah, that was ridiculous, and this is where RPG elements, in my opinion, should have played a role.
The Final Fantasy game that will be healing the firebomb, but here it just makes no difference at all. Final Fantasy XVI's combat feels even less strategic when we look at the supporting progression and itemization systems, and that doesn't take very long because there aren't any. In terms of
the leveling is simple,
level up, which gives you some raw stats. You can't allocate those stats in any way. You get some ability points, which you can use to unlock new abilities, and upgrading them further allows you to equip them even when you're not using the aligned icon. So for example, I can have Ramuh's abilities equipped even if I don't have Ramuh himself equipped. That's it. That's really all you get in terms of progression and customization. Think of the sphere grid of 10, or the job system of 14 or 12, the materia system of 7, the junction system of 8.
And not all of them were good. Like the junction system is not particularly well liked by many people. And like I know some boomers like really love it, and but like people who like new to the franchise, like they just go insane from it. And it's like, yeah, so it left a lot of this behind for a, like it's not like it left it for nothing. Like this action-based system had to be designed from the ground up for this. So this idea that's like, oh, it's not turn-based, so it's basically nothing, or it's like, oh, it's not hybrid, so it's basically nothing. That's not true. It's like, oh, it's not RPG. Yes, and it is lesser because it does have fewer RPG elements. And I would actually agree with that. As I said, fire bombs shouldn't take damage from fire attacks. However, that is part of the accessibility of the game, so that you can basically unload any ability and just defeat them with brute strength. And you could argue that like maybe Clive's fire is different than the fire bombs, so something bullshitty like that. So even though I agree with him, I don't agree with the conclusion that somehow it is now worse than all the other systems. It's very different, and it's a different direction, which means that it will leave some stuff out. And if they make a sequel that is very similarly structured to this, I would hope that a few more RPG elements. I don't really care for itemization. I think itemization is really overrated. I would rather, like, because you always then have to like deal with like, can you like transmog abilities, and it basically creates like a whole new item stuff. Like, it was like the worst part of God of War Ragnarok, having to deal with that. And it's always essentially the same thing. You rise through the levels, you do your own leveling up, and you find newer, better items that you then either like individually level up, or like you just wait for like the highest thing to drop. And I find that often tedious, because it's not like I'm a genius for choosing an item that is like 2 times higher level. That's not genius. I would rather have the game like somewhat smartly scale with me, and I think this game does that well.
That is here. Itemization, man, this one really fucking sucks. So you have 3 gear slots and 3 accessory slots. If you're using any of the story mode accessories, then they actually take up those 3 slots. So you can potentially have 0 accessory slots available to you. The other accessories you get are mainly to reduce the cooldown timers on your abilities,
as I've mentioned,
damage by like 10% or whatever. It's all pretty enough, and I actually think reducing cooldown timers on abilities is a bad thing, because it makes your combat rotation feel even more crowded than it already is. You have slots for a belt.
No, because you cannot give that to that many abilities. Like, you have like 3 slots, maybe one will be like damage, one will be like cooldown for one. I actually recommend you actually start with like that easy story mode, because some of those things are actually cool to play around with, and then maybe one of them will be dead, or maybe it will be like another cooldown, and then you have like 2 cooldowns out of like overall 6 of those abilities. And then you still have like your standard like icon based move, and then you have like your regular attacks. And then you have your combos. I don't think that reducing cooldown is bad.
The wrist guards, they have some defense and HP on them. The HP, by the way, it represents approximately 1% of your HP pool. Like, I'll have 2,000 HP, and I'll be wearing a belt that gives me 20 HP. So, you know, we're dealing with items that buff our stats by 1%. Swords.
Yes, because the primary thing of that wasn't the HP,
I'll be wearing a belt that gives
but it was your defense. Your HP is like primarily based on your level, and this is like a little extra thing, which if you actually play the game, and you will find situations where you're like left with 5% of your HP, then suddenly you will be very, very grateful for having had like the highest level item. You also, by the way, can upgrade items individually, and then you obviously get like higher level items, but like look at this. Those are defensive items. Those are not HP items.
20 HP. So, you know, we're dealing with items that buff our stats by 1%. Swords. Man, what a bummer. When you beat major bosses, you get to craft these sick-looking swords, and you imagine that they might have some elemental alignment, such that if you're using the Ramu-inspired lightning sword,
yes, that should have been part of the game.
Some awesome modifiers.
Very valid criticism, similar to like the fire bombs. Nothing that I will say against you.
This damage versus the previous sword. That is literally it. I'm not exaggerating. It is just that. I know previous Final Fantasy games have had similarly basic itemization, but they've also had a raft of other RPG customization systems that 16 doesn't have. Plus, it just feels like Clive's choice of sword should be more interesting than it is given this combat model. You will absolutely feel the same thing when you play it for yourself. This poor itemization doesn't just limit combat, it also has flow-on impacts for side quests and exploration. Side quests were already pretty dull, but they're totally unrewarding since there's no gear system to funnel these reward materials into. I run around collecting hundreds of sharp teeth or leather whatevers, and I have no use for any of them because there's nothing to craft, and even if there was, all it would give me is like an additional 1% HP. So we got a character action game in Final Fantasy 16, but think about
if you like really like a fetishist for items in games, I can sort of agree with that. Again, I don't think that's really like where a game like lives or dies.
Away in exchange. No party members, no elemental weaknesses, no buffs or debuffs, no meaningful progression, no itemization, no RPG in a Final Fantasy game. And this is a critical point to understand. Final Fantasy XVI is not an RPG. It is a straight up action game. And you may say, well...
Yes, that's what I expected. When they got the DMC guy, that's exactly what I expected.
We always knew it would be. But did we? Like,
yes.
I knew that this would have character action combat. But I never imagined for a moment that all of the supporting RPG systems would be ripped out of one of the most iconic RPG franchises of all time.
Again, and I have also said that it's very fair to say that they should have had a few more RPG elements. But this idea that it needs to have them, that's a very expectation-based thing.
That that's an upgrade? I don't think it is. I think it sucks. I've spoken a lot about how much Final Fantasy XVI ignores this franchise's legacy. I could probably deal with a lot of that, but taking the RPG out of a mainline Final Fantasy game, that is just too much for me. At the top, I said that Final Fantasy XVI offered three things: Clive, combat, and cutting-edge presentation. The presentation is a really big deal, and I don't want to gloss over it. This is a really, really beautiful looking game.
Okay, I think this will be something we agree on.
Locations you visit, the cinematic in-engine cutscenes, the framing of this action, it is really remarkable to behold. That is something that has always been a hallmark of Final Fantasy games: cutting-edge presentation, and in this aspect, Final Fantasy XVI is 100%
I would also argue that this is probably the first Final Fantasy game that doesn't go necessarily overboard, like maybe Final Fantasy 15, yes, as a mainline entry. Final Fantasy 7 Remake is obviously a little bit different here, but like I would argue that many Final Fantasy games are not really beautiful by modern standards in the way that like some games have aged overall. Like I would argue that a game like Final Fantasy X, it has like a very like beautiful presentation, but it really doesn't hold up that well. Like even in the remake, like I understand obviously like faces, but when it was like originally made, it was very difficult and it was astounding how far they got into it. But I would argue they bit a little more off than they can chew, and I'm not even talking about like system performance running the game. I'm saying that maybe like sometimes a little less is more, and I would say that Final Fantasy 16 is the game that, especially if you evaluate like the fidelity mode, it hits that mark kind of better than any non-chibi Final Fantasy game. Like Final Fantasy 7, when it came out, in my opinion, was kind of ugly. With like it tried 3D, I would argue at a time when 3D simply wasn't ready. I know that's like a crazy thing to say in like hindsight, because in hindsight we either all love it or some people are like from that time they will say, oh, at first I doubted it, but then it was amazing. Yeah, kind of not. I kind of like games that are like more chibi based for systems that clearly aren't designed for a lot of 3D. So
load times when playing this game, that's impressive when it involves
load times are awesome.
Map, and then you're there
basically
like
instantaneous.
It's more impressive in the way it supports the transition between combat and cinematics. The game is constantly moving between the two so quickly, and the only way you can tell is that the playable sections have less graphical fidelity than the cutscenes, but not by a lot. It always looks great no matter what it's doing. Performance is another matter entirely, and sadly this is one area where Final Fantasy XVI does disappoint. The game offers two modes: 4K fidelity at 30 FPS, as well as a performance mode with resolution targeting.
Like, I will be a little contrarian at this point while fully agreeing, which is, yes, performance definitely is subpar in the performance mode. It definitely doesn't hit a 60 FPS while walking through the environments, but then it becomes like a perfect 60 or like a 58 in like super demanding gameplay with a ton of particles, ton of enemies around you. So I don't know how they have like scaled like the LOD systems as you look far from you, because that is where the game struggles, but this is also where frame rate matters the least. And then in actual combat where frame rate is paramount, well, it suddenly works amazing. Plus, I have a VR TV, so anything that isn't below 40 FPS, which yes, sometimes it will drop below that, and then I can really feel it. But anything between 48 and 60 FPS kind of feels the same to me. So yeah, I will not be saying that. Yeah, I will not be excusing the performance, but I will be just providing an honest take on my own experience with the game, which is that like frame rate where it actually matters was great. And I kind of wish there was a 40 FPS mode for like the overall environment, so that it was stable, and then it switched to like 60 during combat.
Yes.
Because I also wouldn't want the combat to stay 60, to be just 40.
Performance mode is very rocky, particularly during exploration.
And
During
no,
combat, it
30
actually
is just
seems
not an
fine,
option
but
for
when
a
you're
character
walking
action
through more
game.
linear main mission environments, the frame rate can really chug down. It's an observation that Digital Foundry have documented in their coverage as well, so if you want more detail on that, be sure to check out their video. Bottom line though, it is definitely not a deal breaker, and walking away from Final Fantasy 16,
Okay, I think that's a good, fair conclusion. It's not a deal breaker, but it's worth calling it out. Oh, I love Baby Torgal. Are we getting to the conclusion
so you might notice
part?
that I titled this video Review, but this sounds like a I do not recommend.
Yes.
So what's up with that? I mean, the truth is, I don't really recommend this, but I know that if I put out a video with the title, people are going to accuse me of clickbait or being contrarian for the sake of views, all that stuff that I'm very used to right now, but I'm particularly sensitive to it here because I know how much this series means to people, and I don't like making videos where I'm like, hey,
I honestly, I probably would be more positive towards it if he had the balls to say I do not recommend Final Fantasy 16. I honestly believe that he didn't say so, not just because of fear of backlash, but because he saw the other reviews and inherently developed some doubts about his own takes, but still, which what I respect, stood firmly by them to deliver a review that maybe some people will agree with. However, I do think that he should have stuck with his regular rating, in my opinion.
It's actually not very good. I genuinely hate making those types of videos. That is why I come back to that thing that I said at the start. Don't worry about what I or anyone else thinks. If Final Fantasy means something to you and you're excited for this, then you should buy it and play it, or at least...
Well, no, that's not true, though. Like, I hate this attitude sometimes. Well, but at the end of the day, reviewers don't matter. If your views didn't matter that much, like, then you wouldn't have become a reviewer. You wouldn't be earning your money by making reviews. You wouldn't expect to have probably like 1 million views or something like on your most relevant reviews. People don't just watch reviews to know what they play or don't, but it's part of finding a consensus. It's part of gaming history to know what the most important game influencers of the time were and are thinking of a game. The idea that you will just throw a review into the ether and expect it to not turn akashic and expect it to not matter in the end because, oh, I just put it out here. No, I like that SkillUp put it out. I like that he stood by his own opinion, regardless if he was seeing at the time that many people were starting to disagree. But I will say that he is wrong on several things because several things are based on his own expectations and some things are based on like an overall negative perception that starts flowing into things that are more positive, and then he covers those more positive things in a more negative way because he got like a little wounded by the stuff he didn't like, which I think if he played through the game in like 2 weeks or like even a full month, I think he would have had a much better impression of it because he wouldn't have felt like, oh, and now I have to do all side missions in like 1 day because I have to give an impression of all side missions, because I honestly think that is not how most people will interact with that game. Most people will probably not do more than 20% of the side missions in their first playthrough. And and even like the lack of like the more difficult modes. Sure, some people will lament it during their first playthrough, and then they will go to their second playthrough with the new difficulty mode, maybe like having done 5 minutes of research and then like seeing, oh, those like side missions are a must, and everything else I might ignore, right? If you're really somebody who dislikes those side missions. And yes, obviously it sucks a little bit to do extra research. I didn't have to. I liked most of what the game offered. And I am fine with having some elements that I don't like as much, because I also enjoy just forming an opinion, interacting with other people's about it. That's part of enjoying a game to me. But I understand if you're doing it professionally, if you have to go with it rather quickly, if you had some really positive expectations because you love the franchise and really turned away from some of this like foundations of that franchise, I understand why SkillUp might feel this way. So I'm not angry with him, but I really hope you see that some of his thoughts really are not as unbiased as he often is, and as he also claims to be in this case.
Seek out a bunch of other reviews from people you trust. There is every chance that you're going to love this. Do not let my take rob you of that. For me personally, though, I do not like this. I really did not. I found myself disappointed by
really
almost
did not
every
like
aspect
it.
of
I was
Individually,
disappointed by
outside of its
almost
combat,
every
I think its
aspect.
components are underbaked or just missing. Think of how much more interesting the side quest design could have been. The semi-open world design, the cast of characters, the progression.
No,
and optimization
like this
systems,
idea that like
even just the core mission
but I
design is
covered
missing.
it already.
There's no innovation across any of those core elements, and many of those elements can't even nail the fundamentals. When taken in aggregate, I think the result is a game that feels really dated. Modern cinematic, story-driven action games have made great strides in fusing world design, dynamic storytelling.
There are people who hate on God of
progression.
War.
Final Fantasy XVI
So
reflects none of that.
it's not like it's a
modernity. Combat
universally
arenas and its
accepted
cutscenes,
fact.
That's it. Final Fantasy games have always strived to be at the cutting edge of game design. They haven't always been successful, but they've tried. Final Fantasy 16 reaches for nothing.
I don't know if that is true. They always tried something different,
I'm sure more
but
than a few people are going to be like,
something
"Dude, you're
new
just
is not
pissed off that
always
this franchise
something
has
cutting
evolved, but you
edge,
just want it to stay the
unless
same."
you mean that you
Final
will
Fantasy
literally
games
like cut
have
yourself with
always
that
been
edge,
about
because
evolution. Think about how
it was
bold
just
to build these
hastily made
elaborate
and
worlds
put
and then toss them aside in each new entry. Think
in
about
your-
the total rebuilding of the combat, progression, itemization, and RPG systems in each new game. Think
Yes,
about how
but those
fearlessly
games were
the series has
turn-based.
moved
Without
from
those
steampunk
elements,
sci-fi
those
to
games
high
are
fantasy
nothing.
and
This
back
is a
again
character
multiple
action
times
game.
now. Hell, 2 of the mainline Final Fantasy entries are MMORPGs. This series has always evolved, and I've always loved it for those evolutions, even when some of those were clumsy and didn't pay off. But in each of those mainline entries was a number of through lines that grounded the series and made them feel connected to one another, even when they were vastly different. And it wasn't just, oh, there's a character named Sid and some crystals. It was more foundational.
Yeah,
elements.
this game is
Party-
not like it does have a party there, just not like they're not over designed like this. I'm sorry, that was fitting for, I believe this is Final Fantasy X, right? Sorry, it's been a long time since I played it. But like, yeah, this game doesn't need that and that. As much as I would like Jill in that outfit, because I'm a freaking degenerate apparently, but it's not like it wouldn't fit that game. It just wouldn't. It sort of fits here, but it's still a little over the top, even in the context of Final Fantasy X. Oh god, I don't know.
companions, a big world to explore, full of things to discover, combat that rewarded strategic thinking and preparation, and a set of RPG systems that let you shape your character. Final Fantasy 16 doesn't have any of that stuff, and so I don't feel like this.
But it does have different stuff. It does have more adult storytelling. It does have, like, I would argue, a smarter plot than most Final Fantasy games. I would argue it has characters that have actual depth, not in the meaning, like, which I will admit, yeah, a lot of Final Fantasy games have characters with a lot of depth, but they aren't as quirky. They show their depth in more subdued, more realistic ways. That is more, I would say that the theme of this game and the overall feel of it is very much maintained. It feels very cohesive. Even though the story does take a big turn, I liked it. Some didn't, which SkillUp didn't even address here. But like, I would argue, and then someone saying, "Oh, it doesn't have RPG elements, or it doesn't have this and that," but it does have a fun and flashy character action combat, which the other games don't. So does that mean that those games are bad because they don't have it, but because they came first, they are automatically better? Because I will struggle to find somebody who actually likes Final Fantasy 15 more than this. With its like, I know it was an action game technically, but like it wasn't as RPG-less as this. It still is worse than this.
Evolution. I actually feel like this is a massive regression. Too many
No.
things that make Final Fantasy unique have been stripped out.
At
here,
worst, it's a
and
side
very little has
grade,
been put in
and
to
then it's a
replace them.
regression in
I asked
very,
myself,
very small
what if this was the
elements.
future of the Final
Like,
Fantasy
as I said,
franchise?
Fireball shouldn't
Well,
take
I
damage
think that
from
would be a
fire.
real shame, because we will have lost one of the most iconic, distinctive RPG franchises in the history of video games, and in its place, we got an action game with some flashy combat and some cutscenes, but not much else.
What do you mean? Like, this is one of the most ridiculous thing you can say. It's like, oh, and some cutscenes. Yes, it has a deep, fun story in the sense that it's a good story. It's not fun in the sense that it's haha. But like, why is different in this case so much worse, right? It's like the 16th mainline game, not even counting like the sequels like 10 and 12 too, not counting Final Fantasy 7 Remake and then like Rebirth and then the third title in it, not counting like all the spin-offs like Final Fantasy Tactics and Crisis Core and all the other stuff surrounding Final Fantasy, not even counting all of the remakes that we are probably gonna get, like Final Fantasy X is going to be remade, or I believe 9 was the next one, and even 8 was like in discussions of being remade. Like, I really cannot abide by this. Beautiful like editing though.
Are you working from home these days?
Okay, good. So it's over. And judging from this, how long is my video? Oh, it's 2 hours and 20 minutes. Okay, so by the end it will be like 2 hours and 30 minutes. So again, no hate towards SkillUp. I really like the guy. I highly recommend many of his other reviews. I highly recommend Final Fantasy 16. I highly recommend you just in general get a PS5 for the amazing titles you can play on it. But I really like, and I'm primarily addressing like people now that probably didn't get this far. I know that nobody's like watching anymore. I understand. I can barely sit anymore. But the reason why I wanted to make this video is because Final Fantasy is special. Even for somebody like me who hasn't played most of the games, but who very much liked Final Fantasy 7 Remake, who was torn on something like Final Fantasy X, and then really didn't like much of Final Fantasy 15, really appreciates what Final Fantasy 14 offers, but just am not an MMO player, so this isn't like a like or dislike thing. So to me, when I played Final Fantasy 16, this is my first mainline game that I play at launch, and I really, really loved it, and I loved the demo. And yes, I will agree that maybe the game overall, the demo is like an 11 out of 10. Like the game overall is like a 9 out of 10 for me, maybe an 8.5. I could see myself for its highest moments even giving it like a 9.5 if you like play the game while really ignoring everything you don't like skipping every side mission, like mid-maxing through like the main story stuff that isn't the super interesting stuff. Then I think you could make like a playthrough like close to a 10 as it gets. But this idea that like, oh, it leaves those things behind for this, but this apparently doesn't matter, like the story, the characters, the world design. And I don't mean like the world design in like which items you can find, but like how beautiful the world is, how it's like marked through its story, and even like the individual characters, like half of them he didn't even show that much throughout it. Like he strongly implies that like the party is like the only characters you get in a Final Fantasy game. To me, the villains in this game are the particular highlight. Something that, for example, Final Fantasy VII Remake, in my opinion, fell short on. With something like Sephiroth not being fully fledged out in the game itself, but obviously he will get like the trilogy. And then like in other games you find like a giant whale, which, I mean, sure, like I understand that it's like a special whale, and here you fight Ultima, who does talk too much, and I wish SkillUp would have mentioned it because we would have found another point to agree on. And it does steer a little away from its environmental allegory. However, it does turn toward a much more like collectivist, leftist, revolutionary attitude, which like a lot of like somewhat right-wing, like neoliberal, like Western reviewers definitely didn't like to mention. That Clive by the end was even like going way farther than his father did, and it shouldn't even be that difficult to claim that, because the people that were mistreated as slaves. We aren't even talking about like wage slavery or like modern concepts of like abusing people in late stage capitalism, but that's neither here nor there. The idea is that it had an allegorical story that then turned into another allegory. But people who didn't want to analyze it deeply, to them it was like, oh, it turns from like a really smart environmental allegory to like a really dumb, like beat up the hidden bad guy stuff. Did you ever consider that like that hidden bad guy is partially representative of said environment, of structural inequalities, of the issues of the world? And this is not SkillUp's points, but those are some other like critical reviews that I have seen of people who clearly didn't fully grasp the story. It's not like you have to read like highly leftist literature. Again, I am center leftist, always have been. There are plenty of like somewhat even conservative viewpoints that I hold. Yet to completely like ignore that this game is smarter than just slavery bad and climate change bad. Like, yeah, no, the game definitely goes further than that. Even just in like the way their hideout works, the way like Clive, regardless of his societal status, is picking up a task where he does like dirt pickup work, is a very like collectivist, dare I say a very socialist attitude. Which again, this is a Japanese game, so it is a society that is far more collectivist than it is individualist. But this is not a Hasanabe video, this is a MarkTech video of a small Apple YouTuber who did a Final Fantasy review. So a Final Fantasy review inside the reaction videos to a SkillUp video, so I don't expect anybody to ever hear what I just said. But regardless, like, I love this game, and I really wanted to make sure that people who love this game, just if you ever look up, like maybe in 200 years, if YouTube doesn't purge this platform and you find like Final Fantasy 16 reviews for some reason, maybe you will find mine, and you will find this like raging lunatic who is reacting to a calm-mannered professional reviewer, and giving his own 2 cents without without a break for 2.5 hours, and then raging on about like neoliberalism. Regardless, I really enjoyed this. I'm completely spent. It's now 2 a.m. And I do have plans for tomorrow, so it's like 5 hours of sleep for me now. But at least I don't have work, so that's kind of fine. Thank you, SkillUp. I wrote SkillUp on Twitter if I could react to this. He didn't say anything, so I took that as a yes. I hope that as much as I paused it and as much as I yelled over it, that this does fit the guidelines for like fair use. And I do know SkillUp is a stand-up guy, so I do hope this doesn't get blocked. I did have a block in the past, but that one was actually Apple. My next video is most likely going to be Apple, but now I don't know when it's going to be, because I will probably have like sleep issues for the next couple of days after this. Thank you to anybody who just tuned in over time. The one person who's apparently still watching, what, are you crazy? Feel free to let me know in the comments, like and subscribe. Let me know what you thought and what you would like to see next. Obviously, you could just let me know how much I suck, apparently. And contact me on Twitter if Twitter will work at some point again, or if it's already working. If you want to include me in like your 600 posts that you can view a day. So thank you very much. I really, really appreciate anybody who watched, like, can go through like even half of this video. And thanks again to SkillUp. Thank you to Square Enix and Yoshi P and anybody who worked on Final Fantasy 16. Thank you to Sony for making the PS5, which runs this game at mostly 45 FPS. I love doing this, and I know this is just a silly hobby, but I hope you enjoyed my rants. I hope you enjoyed my coverage, if you can call it that. This is Mark Tech saying thank you and tuning out.